Matthew Cobb, welcome to the show.
Great to be here, Alex. Thanks for the invitation.
Tell me, where is fancy bread? In the heart or in the head?
Yeah, so for viewers who don't know, that's from Shakespeare. And it's one of the things that I thought was really interesting, that in one of these Shakespeare plays, there's one of these songs in the middle of it, the bits you skip over at school, in which somebody sings, "Tell me where is fancy bread, or in the heart or in the head." And what that encapsulates is the beginning of a shift in European knowledge about where fancy imagination might lie. Is it in the heart or is it in the head? And I thought it was really interesting that not only that Shakespeare knew that people were worrying about this and thinking about it, but also that he knew that the groundlings, the people who were standing up at his plays and would throw cabbages if they weren't happy, that they would get the joke as well. They'd understand it. So it wasn't just him being clever. It actually reveals something about popular culture at the turn of the end of the 16th, beginning of the 17th century. So what it reveals is something that humanity's kind of mused about for a long time, is what is the seat of imagination and thought? And for most of the time, most of humanity has thought it's in the heart, as far as we can tell. Very few peoples around the world, none in fact, thought it was in the head. It required a great deal of investigation and thinking for that to begin to become apparent in the 15th, 16th century.
Yeah, I mean, this features at that quote is from the end of the first chapter of The Idea of the Brain, which is a book I picked up a few months ago now, and I found this really interesting because it's intentionally kind of a history of our understanding of the brain. It's not a book of neuroscience. It's not a book of philosophy of mind. It's. Would you consider it like a history book?
Oh yeah, very much so. I mean, that's the subtitle is a history in English.
I suppose so. Yeah, it's I think it's great, and it opens with this sort of taking us back to the beginning, these sort of ancient thinkers who believed that the heart was, as you say, the seat of fancy or imagination. And in a way, I mean, you talk about how this is embedded into our language. We say things like, "I'm heartbroken," where like brain broken doesn't really seem to imply the same thing, or, you know, his heart isn't in it. And people will probably sort of understand that, but specifically speaking, like as a scientist of the time, what were the like motivations that people like Aristotle had for thinking that the heart was where thought came from?
Well, that's what it feels like. Yeah. I mean, you might think that you're thinking in your head, but if you think about what you feel, you don't feel, if you feel excited, you're not excited up here. You're excited in your whole body, in your guts. If your heart starts to pound, if you're frightened, or, you know, your guts start to squirm, if you're feeling passionate, it's not in your head. So everyday experience, if you're just thinking about it, which is all that people had for most of the time, it would suggest strongly that there's something going on here, not up here. And I mean, it's a bit like the sun going around the earth. People thought that because that's what it looked like. And you'd have to be very, very odd or to have made incredibly precise observations to realize that it's the earth that goes around the sun. And that's why it took us so long to figure that out. And it also took us a long, long time to work out that the heart is simply a very weird kind of pump pushing the blood around the body. I mean, it also is, people also thought that because when they did do dissections, or they looked at animals or whatever, then you've got the blood, which seems really important. And the brain just is this kind of mushy white stuff. So Aristotle, for example, thought it was a kind of radiator. Its sole function was for cooling the blood, and that the really important stuff was going on in the heart and in the blood and all the rest of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's understandable, right? Because it's not just that you feel it there, but also you can kind of measure it. You can,
absolutely.
You can put your heart on your chest, and when your emotions change, your heart starts pounding faster, but your head doesn't sort of seem to do anything.
No.
And yet, at the time, there were ways to begin to understand human biology. Like you say, you can dissect animals, you can perform experiments on animals. And what was the sort of extent of like empirical science work on thinking at this sort of time period?
They did things like, if you get a sheep's head, then you can see that it's got its eyeballs, and connected to its eyeballs are these threads, which they called neurons, which just simply means thread, sinew, and that connects to the brain in some way. But there was no reason to think that there's any kind of what we would call information, or there's any message, or the image is somehow going down there into the brain. And if you did think that, then all you would notice was all the connections of the brain to the heart, and you'd say, well, there you go, it's the heart. So simple dissections and looking at anatomy could help, but they didn't really solve the question. I mean, some people did think this. So some of the ancient Greeks who wrote under the name of Hippocrates, as well known as the father of medicine, they began to argue, well, no, the brain is really what it's about. And one of the reasons they were thinking about this was to do with brain injuries, head injuries, or epilepsy. And they began to think, well, okay, maybe the brain is much more important than what Aristotle argues. The key experiment was done by a man who developed what passed for medicine for about 1,500 years, Galen, who was born in Turkey. He was a Greek citizen. He was Greek ethnically, but was a Roman citizen. So he's working at the end of beginning of the century, the Common Era. And he worked as a physician in the arenas. So he'd see a lot of damage being done to fighters who were gladiators who were, getting damaged. And one of the things from medicine and even from sports injuries, so if you play a contact sport like rugby, that it's very easy to damage the voice, because our voice is controlled, we'll maybe come on to this later on, is controlled by this front left heart part of the brain. And the neuron, the nerve that controls that, controls your voice box, goes all the way down, loops under your heart, and comes all the way back up here. So it's one of the examples we give as showing that the body isn't designed, because it's just kind of crazy. If you were going to design it, you just go straight down. And that's to do with our evolutionary origins and the origins of the nerve and all the rest of it. But the key point is, if you play rugby and you get hit on the chest, then you can lose your voice. You can damage your voice because you're damaging this neuron. And one of the things that Galen noticed was that this could happen to gladiators. And so he was convinced that the brain, you could see the connection between this part of the brain in both a human but also in animals, and the voice. And he did a rather gruesome experiment. So if you are of a nervous disposition, you should fast forward a minute or so.
Yes.
So he got a pig. He wanted to prove his point. And so he did an experiment, which was really a kind of demonstration. It was a way of an argument with his opponents. So they got a pig. And of course, there are no anesthetics at this time, so it's pretty gruesome. They chain the pig down. They bind its snout so it can't bite you. And then they open it up. And the pig is very unhappy, as you can imagine. It's squealing. It's making a terrible racket through this muffled muzzle. And Galen says to his opponent, who thinks that the heart is control of all behaviour, including the production of the voice, he says, right, put your hand round the heart, which of course is pounding away. And the man puts his hand, holds the heart, so it can't move anymore. No blood pumping, but the pig carries on squealing. Galen then says, okay, right. So they flip the poor old pig over. It's still conscious. They crack open its skull, which would have involved a chisel of some kind. And they bare the brain. The pig's still making a noise. And then Galen says to his opponent, right, push down on the brain. So he pushes down on the brain. And instantly, of course, the poor old pig becomes unconscious and no longer makes a noise. So this was an experimental proof of a kind that the brain was involved in controlling the voice and it wasn't the heart. Despite this experiment being well known, didn't change anybody's mind. The vast majority of people, obviously, people who weren't educated carry on believing what it feels like. It's my heart, if they thought about it at all. But most clever people who knew about Galen's experiment didn't actually end up saying, okay, well, the brain is the seat of thinking and emotion. This gradually developed a bit in medieval times. You can find strange diagrams of people became very interested in what are called the ventricles of the brain.
Right.
So the ventricles are these kind of fluid-filled areas inside the brain, and people thought that there are three main ventricles, and that memory was in one part, thought was in another, and I can't remember whatever.
Well, there's sort of these gaps, right? Which
absolutely.
we know are filled with fluid, but they also seem like if the brain is just this inert matter, they seem like these sort of spaces in which, thought or...
Yeah, and also they're full of liquid. And you've got to remember, well, how would you conceptualize thought? at the time, and the main word they would use would be spirit, i.e. this is some kind of non-material, it's a movement of something like air or like water. So if you've got a load of fluid-filled bits in your brain, then maybe that's where you can actually imagine that thought or whatever is based. So that was a thread, but most, as I say, there was no decisive evidence. I think the key point that people need to realize is there never was. There's no brain-centric moment. There isn't a moment at which the apple falls from the tree and Newton goes, aha, gravity. I mean, that didn't happen either, but there's no experiment that convinces everybody.
Right.
And I think in general in science, that's the case. It's very rarely at the time that people go, oh my God, this changes everything. What they do is say, that's really interesting, but maybe it's not right. And then within a few years, there's extra evidence and they end up saying, okay, we change our mind now. But that took centuries of work, mainly in Europe. And that really, it's only by the middle of the 18th century that all thinkers, so physicians and philosophers and others, agree that it's something to do with the brain in some mysterious way, that thought is either emanating from the brain, it's produced by the brain, or if you are what's called a dualist, that is, you think that thought is an immaterial matter, as Descartes put it, which is rather hard to make sense of. But he thinks that thought is or the soul comes into the brain, it accesses the physical world through a particular gland called the pineal gland. And he was very certain of this because only humans, he said, have the pineal gland, but in fact, virtually all mammals do. So people fairly soon showed that was wrong. But even Descartes, who had this dualist idea, he was convinced that it was the brain that was the key organ.
Yeah, but in the face of experiments like Galen's, and it is such a shame that so many important scientific developments have come at the cost of some exquisite tortures to animals and indeed humans. I mean, you talk later in your memory chapter about the patient HM, is what he went by, right, who underwent some horrible trauma in his life, but which gave rise to a great deal of scientific understanding. But in the face of such experiments, grotesque as they were, how would somebody who believed that the heart is the seat of consciousness and thinking see the heart have no effect and pressing down on the brain have all the effect, and then still say, no, I still think it's the heart? Like, do we have any records of how they responded to this?
No, not as far as I know. I mean, the key point they would say is, well, they go back to that's what it feels like. So, okay, this is this experiment on a pig and maybe the voice is something different. So it's about voice. It's clearly not only about voice because the pig goes unconscious, but then you can make up all sorts of explanations. Given there is no kind of coherent theory for what's going on, you can make, ad hoc, as they're called, explanations on the hoof to try and, okay, we can explain that away. And I think that this is what it feels like. That's the reason. That's the reason for all these linguistic fossils. It's not only in English. When I give talks about this in other countries, I always I have a slide with all these phrases about, sweetheart and heart was in my mouth and all the rest of it, and ask the locals to translate it into their language using colloquial phrases, and they've all got them. Every culture has those phrases.
Yeah, that is interesting. And I think we need to remember that our intuitions, having grown up in a world that's quite certain of the role of the brain in thought, like those intuitions are very deeply baked and hard to shake off. So like earlier when you said, well, hold on, like, you can open up a brain and see that the eye is connected by this thread to the brain. So like, surely it's to do with the brain. But again, we just intuitively assume that, because a message gets sent down, because we're used to things like electricity and cables and how if two things are connected with a metal wire, there's information traveling down. But an ancient person would look at this as no more relevant than the fact that a chandelier is like hanging off the ceiling. To imagine that somehow that could convey information would probably be as mysterious as that it would, jump from the heart right up to the eyeball, And so we've got to sort of shake those intuitions off to then sort of do the history of how we came to adopt those intuitions.
And that was one of the most interesting thing about the book was trying to unlearn things, right?
Yeah, right.
So part of the problem with the history of science is that it looks like it's a series of progressive steps because science is cumulative. So, as Newton said, we stand on the shoulders of giants. That's true, but those giants themselves made all sorts of mistakes and errors just as we do. And understanding how we got to where we are there was nothing inevitable about it, and the particular passage, the pathway, the set of discoveries were not inevitable. So one of the things I used to tell my students was that you cannot, and I say this at the beginning of the book, you're allowed to find past beliefs amusing. I mean, that I can't forbid people from laughing sometimes because some of the people's beliefs are a bit odd, but you are not allowed to think they're stupid because people are very clever. They're no less clever than we are. They just know less because, we only know this stuff because we've been told it, right? There's very little that any of us have discovered ourselves, right? You've read it in a book, somebody's told you, you've seen it on the internet. Okay. So the question then is, if peoples or individuals or groups didn't understand something that we think is self-evident, why didn't they? And what did they think in its place?
Yeah.
And that is part of the challenge. So it means removing all the vocabulary. So things like information and message, I couldn't use them. I forbade myself to use them until I got to the bits where people at the time were starting to think in those ways. So there's a kind of a restriction on the vocabulary you can use in order to try and reconstruct the ideas that people had and be fair and faithful to them.
We'll get back to the show in just a moment, but first, if you've been watching this show for some time now, you'll know that for ages I've been recommending a way to deal with bias in news media. Bias will never go away, but using today's sponsor, Ground News, you can mitigate that bias by objectively comparing the way that different sources are reporting on the same story. Ground News works by aggregating thousands of local and international news outlets all in one place, so you can compare reporting across the political spectrum. Try it out at ground.news/AlexOC. Take a look at this story about Canada's Prime Minister saying that his country should debate a social media ban for children. Using Ground News, I can see that of all the sources reporting on this story, 85% of them lean to the left, with 15% of them sitting in the centre and no right-leaning coverage at all. This means that if you only typically read right-leaning news, you could have just missed this story altogether. Ground News even has a dedicated blind spot tab, which specifically seeks out stories that you would otherwise miss based on the news that you normally read. And Ground News even has a feature called My News Bias, which gives you a breakdown of the news that you're reading. What are the sources? Who owns them? What are their political associations? So that you can understand the bias in your news media. So try it out for yourself by going to ground.news/AlexOC or by scanning the QR code that's on your screen. Use my link to get 40% off their unlimited access Vantage plan. And with that said, back to the show. Yeah, it's a great fallacy. We all too easily say like, oh, those people back then, those silly, illiterate, stupid people who didn't know anything. It's like, maybe they didn't know as many things as we did, but they were just as intelligent to the extent that if you picked one up and dropped them into the modern day, they could learn calculus.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And it's like there's that sort of internet meme of like, getting in a time machine and being like, I'm going to go back and I'm going to amaze, these medieval peasants with the technology of the modern day. And so you get there and they're like, okay, so how does, you said a computer chip, so how does that work? And like,
well, yeah.
I've got absolutely no idea. It wouldn't even remotely speed up the process. But, there has been a very long history of this development from Galen squeezing the heart of a pig up until, as you say, like only in the past few hundred years when consensus began to develop about the brain's role. That's a long stretch of history, but what do we know about some of the important developments that took us from that ancient worldview to this more modern worldview? Like, were there any, and you said there are no sort of definitive moments, but are there any sort of tipping points on the scale of like a few hundred years?
Well, there's kind of
moments?
Inflections rather than tipping points. I mean, it's an arc. And so I think the key thing is the development of anatomy, anatomical studies. And begins in the 15th century and becomes a pace that you can actually now dissect human bodies. And it's very hard to understand why that began, because although it happened in ancient Greece, there's a long period in which even Arabic physicians who, developed a whole area of medicine and anatomy and so on, they were not dissecting human bodies.
Yeah.
And we don't know why. Doesn't seem to be anything about religion. This is forbidden or whatever. It may well have been looked down upon, and I guess it still is now. But there was no kind of legal or absolutely accepted legal or religious framework to stop people doing that. But in the 14th, 15th century, physicians in Europe start to anatomize dead bodies and to describe what's in there. Up until then, they had simply relied, this is what was called scholasticism. So when the Europeans caught up, so the Arabic world had translated ancient Greek manuscripts while we were all kind of taking chunks out of each other in the Dark Ages, and had also developed maths, chemistry, medicine, and so on. When that knowledge came into Europe in around the 12th, 13th century, there were translations into Latin and so on, then that's when things start to kick off for all sorts of reasons. And it coincides with the development of printing. So you've got printed, you haven't just got manuscripts where you're referring to what Galen said and so it must be true, but now you can actually find out new knowledge. And this links as well with ultimately with the rise of Protestantism, which says that, we can get direct access to the Word of God by the Bible. We don't need a priest. Is the most kind of extreme version of Protestantism, that I can read the Word of God and I can find it out. And there's a similarity, and some historians have argued there's actually a link between that approach, much more direct access to knowledge, religious belief, and scientific knowledge in a period that is roughly called the Scientific Revolution. Some historians get very cross and say there was no such thing. One guy called Stephen Shapin wrote a little book called The Scientific Revolution, and it begins, "There was no such thing as the Scientific Revolution, and this is a book about it."
Yeah.
Now, I think there was a scientific revolution, but it was a rather odd revolution. It went on for about 150, 200 years, and in some senses we're still in the middle of it.
Yeah.
So it's a change in thought, which is partly saying that I don't need to rely on Galen anymore. It's jolly interesting, but I can actually myself investigate what's in the body. And one of the things that they did, Vesalius was the most important one. He produced a fantastic 8-volume book of human anatomy with marvelous woodcuts. Ultimately, let's say there were prints later on, so actually printed on metal, showing the human body in glorious detail. And he also anatomized the brain and showed that it was this really complicated structure. And that began to get people very interested in England in the 17th century. A man called Willis did similar dissections of the brain. And really what it's showing is, look, the heart by this stage had been shown to be a pump, as I said. And it's a weird kind of pump, but it's a pump. And you know that the blood's just going round and round in a circle, and this bizarre thing is pumping back and forth. So that's okay. But that really does suggest that it's probably not doing anything more than that. Whereas the brain, whatever it is connected to all the sense organs. It's astonishingly complicated, even without using microscopes and whatever they could see. It's very, very complicated to understand. And that increasingly led by the 18th century to people saying, okay, it's the brain. So I think it's anatomy which is the key thing. There weren't really experiments that people could do or anything, although, people like Descartes were thinking about how it might all work. And they were starting to use metaphors to think about what might be going on. So one of the things that Descartes did was so he's in the 17th century, in about 1630 or so, he's wandering around in the public parks in Paris, and there were these animatronic statues, which would be things like, you'd be walking along and then this dragon would come out and go back in, it was all powered by hydraulics. So that was the height of technology at the time. You could have weights pushing water up and down and these things would move. And what's striking is that there had been similar devices in ancient Greece, either operated by water or steam or air. So there were little models that would move, but nobody actually, even back then, thought, well, maybe that's how we work. Whereas what Descartes said, well, okay, maybe there's some kind of pressure in our nerves. That's what causes changes to movement. And he has this very famous picture you can find on the internet of this great big kind of man baby whose foot is touching a fire, and there's a kind of diagram of this line going up to the brain and back down again. And basically what Descartes' saying is that you detect something on your foot, it burns, it goes up, and the pressure goes up and bounces back down, and you move your knee.
Mm-hmm.
This was later developed as the idea that the whole system was reflecting back. That's where we get reflex from. So it's the idea of, there's this whatever it is going up and coming down.
Yeah. And it's not like, this might sound kind of familiar. It's like, oh yeah, like, well, we do have nerves and information kind of is sent from the foot up to the brain and back down again. But again, before an understanding of something like electricity, what would that look like? And so, maybe it's like water or air or something. Yeah. So it's sort of getting the right kind of idea is beginning to develop. But again, you have to remember that you don't have the like conceptual imagery of like neurons firing or electrical signals or anything that doesn't exist. So you look at a hydraulic press and think, oh, maybe it's air. So a lot of people would think that they were like literally like air sort of being pumped through these nerves. And that's, again, quite a sensible assumption. If you pull apart a body and you see that there's kind of a really thin tube connecting these two things, well, what else is going to be going up and down?
Yeah, and on the other hand, it was fairly easy to demonstrate that it was wrong. Right. His idea was that there would be this hydraulic pressure. And so one man who's 17th century, mainly working on insects, he also studied frogs and movement. And so he just cut a nerve in the frog's leg and nothing came spurting out.
Yeah.
But he still said, well, okay, well, maybe Descartes' right. Maybe it's something like a vibration. He said, well, if you imagine you got a plank of wood and you hit one end, then you can feel the vibration at the other. Maybe that's what's going on. So, you can see that without the kind of understanding that we would have about electricity or electrochemical changes, which is really what's going on in our neurons, it's very hard to conceptualize. So all these people are grasping using the technology of the time. And that really is when actually the book took form for me. So it took about 5 years to write it. And at the beginning, it was awful. It was really bad. It was just one damn thing after another. And I couldn't make sense of it. And it was just going to be a really, really boring book. And then it suddenly occurred to me, it was around about this period, so I started at the beginning and carried on, that I thought, wait a minute, there's something interesting here about how our ideas about what the brain is doing are changing with technology. And the book is really about the metaphors we've used, so the analogies, the similarities we pointed to at different points. And it's always to do with the peak of technology.
Yes. Yeah.
So, Descartes, amazing. You got hydraulics. That's fantastic. Us today, amazing. We've got computers or large language models. That must be how it works. Mm-hmm. And I thought that once I realized that, I remember sending an email to my editor saying, I've made a conceptual breakthrough, which sounds rather fancy, but it actually meant that now I had a framing, not only for what I now had to go back and rewrite, but also for where I was going to go in the future. And I thought, okay, that's interesting. That makes sense. And it also makes it really exciting because then you think, and scientists do this because they don't think about what they use these words, code and information. They don't worry about where it comes from. It all seems natural to them. And if you say, look, this is bound to the technology of the time, different from Descartes thinking about hydraulics, they go, so you mean this might change in the future with new technology? And you go, yes, of course. Mm-hmm. And they go, oh, that's amazing. So what is it? My answer has always been, well, if I knew what the future technology is, I'd be very rich. I have no idea.
Yeah.
But we can just see that thinking is linked to the conceptions of machines in particular and power and forces, and that will change in the future.
Yeah, I think it's extremely interesting. Like I've heard that some people had compared, the brain to like an intricate kind of harp or something, whatever sort of complex, whatever the most complex thing they could think of, the brain must be a little bit like that. And that should give us perhaps some pause in thinking like, okay, maybe saying the brain is like a computer or an AI system is kind of accurate in some ways, but we should remember that this is a metaphor. We'll get onto this, but it's worth remembering that metaphors are not saying it's the same thing as,
absolutely.
and that's the mistake that has so often been repeated. And the only mistake that's repeated more than that is thinking that we are now somehow not making a mistake. But okay, so I suppose, because I want to talk about sort of once we've established that the brain is the key sort of part of thought, I want to talk about some of these more recent developments. But I kind of just want to ask, like, just to fill in this picture of exactly how we got there, like, it can't have just been Galen does an experiment in the ancient world, and then it takes 2,000 years for people to finally accept it. There must have been other stuff going on, or was it really just a case of, like, I guess it was like the discovery, you said like anatomy, but like the discovery of nerves, people noticed that they were up to the brain, and I suppose also the discovery that the heart is just kind of a pump, this kind of stuff just slowly grew a consensus that the brain is what matters here.
Yeah.
And you said it was around about when that people finally were sort of on board?
In the middle of the 18th century.
Right.
And that coincides with the next big breakthrough in thinking about how the universe works, but also how movement occurs. And that's the discovery of the electricity.
Yes.
And very soon people were able to show that electric shocks, initially was the initial way they do it, would produce movement.
Yeah.
And you could do this, for example, with a frog's muscle. And they generate electricity by, this initially would be static electricity.
Yeah.
So you get a bit like when you're a kid and your dad, or now if you're a dad, you get a balloon and you rub it on your jumper and it sticks on the wall.
Yeah.
Static electricity. So you can produce a charge by rubbing wool against amber, for example. And there were people who were called electricians who would have this as a party piece. And they go around and you go in and you'd get for example, there was a show called The Electrified Boy where you get a hapless child and you'd winch them up to the ceiling and then you'd electrify them with the static electricity, and then you'd throw a load of feathers in the air, and of course all the feathers would stick on the poor child. So you could do things like this,
which again, like, would have been extraordinary to see.
Yeah, absolutely.
When this is like new, when this is hot off the press, an incredible.
Yeah, I mean, it was very eerie. Interestingly, people also started to use it as an early form of therapy.
Mm-hmm.
So there were itinerant electricians who would go around the country and give you an electric shock. So they charge this thing up, and then you really high charge, and then you touch it and you get an electric shock, and it might or might not help cure your mental health problems. So for example, Marat, the French revolutionary, before he went on to lead the French Revolution in 1789, he was touring the United Kingdom, giving people electric shocks because he was a great believer in the power of this. So there was a link between movement, perhaps something to do with mental health. That was kind of unclear, but a whole series of reports of how this might work that led people to think it wasn't just nonsense. And we're still not clear about the power of this kind of therapy, which was developed substantially in the 20th century and is making a bit of a comeback today. The key development, however, came with the development of what we call in English batteries. And this was to try and resolve an argument that was taking place as to whether there was electricity in an animal or whether it was simply responding to it. Because even if you're getting this response, you put you generate an electric current and you touch a muscle with it. If it contracts, well, okay, but it'll do the same if you put a drop of acid on it.
Yeah,
so it might be an irritant. So people were thinking very hard, and if they weren't happy with the idea, they'd try and find other explanations. And with the development of the batteries, which were developed as a bit of biomimicry. So Volta, who's where we get the word volt from, he was trying to develop something. They studied electric fish, so fish that will give you a shock if you touch them. And they knew the organ that produced the electric shock, and it had these kind of layers in it. And he decided to try and imitate this. And so he makes layers of using cardboard and metal and acid, and he produces a pile of these things. And this in the end would produce an electric current. Now, we in English call this a battery, but in every other language, it's called, for example, in French, it's called une pile, still called a pile. The only
interesting.
word where only time we still talk about piles in this sense is talking about atomic power, where we call it an atomic pile, but that's because the guy who first developed it was Italian. So he was basically, we should be calling it an atomic battery. But it goes back to this piece of biomimicry, as I say.
Interesting. Okay.
And in the beginning of the 19th century, you can now store electricity. And you could do dramatic things like one philosopher got about 300 monks and got them all to hold hands. So you got about 600 meters worth of monk.
Mm-hmm.
And he goes to one end and he connects them to this battery, which just releases the power. And the electricity, the current goes down and they all jump up one after another.
Mm.
And then you could do things, for example, people would do, you could go to the London stage and see shows in which people would bring on a cow's head. The poor old cow had just been slaughtered backstage. They'd bring on the cow's head and then put its electrodes on either side of its ears or whatever, and its eyes would open, its tongue would roll.
Yeah, I mean, that's terrifying, right?
Yeah,
and that would have, they did that at like the Royal Institution, is that where they used to do that?
Well, this would be done as just for fun as theatre. So you could go to the Drury Lane and watch it. And there was a notorious private demonstration of this in London where 12 members of the Royal Society went in. A man who'd killed his wife and child was hanged, and then they immediately took his body down and put it in a room with these members of the Royal Society, and they did the same thing. And of course, you put electrodes on a body and its eyes are going to open. And so there's a famous engraving of all these scientists fleeing because this seems like
would sort of, the eyes would open.
Yeah, absolutely. And arms would move.
Really?
So what we know, so some listeners may be thinking, hang on a minute, this sounds very familiar. In about 1815, so all this was done at the beginning of the 19th century. In 1815, a young woman she was a teenager, called Mary Godwin. She went to the Royal Institution, you just mentioned, which is this newly created centre for scientific communication, which still exists, marvellous institution. And she saw or we think she saw some similar demonstrations to the ones I described with the sheep's heads and all the rest of it. No humans were involved. I mean, there were only a couple of experiments like that because it was quite rightly seen as pretty foul. And so she saw this idea that you could actually resurrect life using electricity. And then 2 or 3 years later, she'd run off with the notorious poet and revolutionary Shelley. She had become Mary Shelley. And on their honeymoon, because there was a volcano in Indonesia, the weather was awful. So the world's weather patterns changed. They were on holiday in Switzerland. It's raining all the time. So they sit around and they say, let's write ghost stories. And Mary Shelley writes Frankenstein on the basis of this idea of you can actually reanimate life by sticking bits together.
Incredible.
Yeah,
it's incredible, isn't it? What an incredible... I love those little historical footnotes more than like anything. It's that and etymology that come out on this podcast that are my favorite things in the world. But when you talk about electricity, people might be thinking, I mean, I find it very difficult to remember that when we're talking about electricity as it was discovered, we're not talking about exactly like the kind of stuff that you find in like an iPhone or an iPad or something. It's hard to sort of explain exactly what's going on there. But what do we mean by electricity when we're talking about like the brain or organisms and how it's affecting? Like, what is this thing called electricity?
Well, when electricity in a wire, you've got a solid wire, and the current is the movement of electrons down that path, down from one end to another, because there's a difference in potential, so it's going to go from one end to the other. In neurons, and this took an awful long time to find out, and it was only really resolved after the Second World War in the 1950s. It's electrochemicals. We've got chemicals in our neurons, in all our cells, and you get a difference in same principle. You get a difference in the potential on either side of the membrane, the surface of the cell, and our cells have got little pores in them. And when a neuron is activated, then there's this wave of changes, this movement of ions of different chemicals in and out of the neuron, and that passes down in the same kind of wave. So it's an electrochemical. But I mean, you can, if you, as I've just described, if you use an electric electrode, it makes that happen. So it's the same thing. It's just that it's fluid and moving rather than at an atomic level, of course, rather than like a tap. It's not like that. But it's this movement of ions, different charge forms of atoms in and out of our cells every second, every millisecond. Or, what I'm doing now, that involves really, really complicated activities of all those neurons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's a similar kind of process, because electricity just being like loose electricity, and those electrons just sort of move down a wire, and that's the thing that's moving down. It's something kind of similar going on in the brain. Okay, so there's the discovery of electricity, of its existence. Then there's the discovery that it seems to affect organisms. And then you said, well, some people thought maybe this was just a reaction. Then presumably at some point we managed to establish that no, like that's what's actually happening in the brain. When does that happen? How does that happen? And like, why is that important?
Well, it happens partly by metaphor.
Right.
In that people drew maps of the nervous system, and by this stage, by about 1838, the telegraph had been invented, and so you can send messages, and you have a map of the telegraph system of England, for example, and you've got the centre, sadly, is London, and then emanating from it or going to it are all these literal wires that messages are being sent down. And two things are happening. One, the centre is telling the provinces what to do, but it's also receiving information. This word started to be used. It's receiving signals from the provinces saying what is going on. So people actually literally drew a parallel and said, this is actually what is happening in the brain. Our brain is some complicated kind of telegraph system. So it made us a big leap, just as technology had, the transformation of the United Kingdom, of the whole of Europe, and then the United States, with the development of the railways, which literally paralleled the telegraph system. They went down the side. That technological development was then used to try and understand what was going on in the brain. The brain must be doing something similar. So people start to think about telegraphing and so on. And one particular chap who I discovered in writing the book, who I hadn't heard of, and very few people apart from a handful of historians of 19th century know about, a chap called Arthur Smee, he came up with the idea that this was literally what was happening in the brain. The brain worked like a telegraph system, and therefore I can make a version of that. I can actually construct it. I can actually construct an image, something out of metal that will represent a concept. And he came up with an idea for the way that information, or the way that signals from very simple inputs from sensory perception could then be combined. And this is all very vague, but when I show if you show those diagrams to somebody who works on large language models, they get really excited because they say, look, that's just the kind of thing we draw to try and show how ChatGPT can actually respond to us in the way it does. There's all these complicated cross-cutting combinations. Now, Smee's device is very hard to make sense of, and he never built anything. He wasn't trying to build a computer, right? He's building a brain. Out of brass and screws. And he hasn't, although he is thinking about electricity, and he even thinks, he invents the fax machine, actually, because he says, look, if what's going on in the brain is we've got an eye, and there are photoelectric cells. There are cells that are turning light into electricity, and that's going down the wire into the brain. We could do that. Technologically, we could get some kind of device that would turn light into electricity. We could point it at, a picture of the Tower of London, and then send it down the wire to Edinburgh or whatever.
Yeah.
Now, he never built it, but I mean, he was a completely cranky inventor. He also ended up working on inks and electrodes, which were later used in experiments to understand the brain. But the key point is that this metaphor of the telegraph system is really taken to heart by thinkers, because they can now find a very powerful metaphor, not just for the organization of the nervous system, but for
Right.
what is going up and down them. It's messages, it's information. And that immediately makes an intuitive sense.
Yeah. Okay, so we've sort of arrived at this realization that the brain is kind of working electrically, sending a kind of signal or information, and that it's definitely the brain that's doing it. So then the next question that someone might have in trying to uncover the mystery of how we think is like, well, okay, we've got all kinds of thoughts, all kinds of different stuff going on. We've got memories, we've got emotions, we've got like behaviors that we do. We've got this one big brain that sort of does it all. But there's also this growing understanding that the brain is quite a complicated organ. And of course the debate becomes, well, is there just this one great big brain doing everything? Or is the brain like a sort of divvied up, civil service of people all with their own little telegrams to send out to different parts of the body?
Well, that's what if you really took it to its end point, that's what the kind of informational 19th century Dickensian bureau system of thinking in the brain would lead you to. And that is kind of where people ended up, but it depended what nationality you were. So one thing that was very, very popular throughout the 19th century, even up into the 20th century, was what's called phrenology. That is the idea that you can feel the shape of your skull, that will tell you something about your personality. Because the theory went, the shape of the skull revealed the shape of these structures in the brain, and those structures in the brain were kind of the localization of different functions. This is the term that scientists and historians have used to kind of describe this debate, the localization of function. Is this bit of the brain doing a particular thing? And this was incredibly popular. I mean, you can think of a bit like horoscopes today. I mean, people might still say, well, I'm Aquarius rising, whatever. Okay, what are you? And, without taking it too seriously. But Queen Victoria took it very seriously.
Yes.
She had her children phrenologized. Karl Marx, the German revolutionary, he took it very seriously. He would feel somebody's head, a new comrade, to see, are they trustworthy? Are they on the right line? And I recently discovered, I've just finished a biography of Francis Crick. When he was a child, Francis Crick was phrenologized by a traveling phrenologer who amazingly said, yes, your son's, said to his mother, your son's head is really interesting. Maybe I should come back again and do it again. So, I mean, this is clearly nonsense, right? Because, your skull's really thick and all the lumps on it do not correspond to organs in the brain. But it was very, very popular. And what it led to was kind of a pushback from, in particular, the scientists. They said, well, this is garbage. And the French scientists in particular,
right, for
two reasons. Firstly, they said, well, if we look at the brain, it's divided in two, and those two halves are mirrored. So it's kind of perfect in that sense, because you've got two identical halves. Secondly, Descartes said that thought is unitary. Thought is one thing. Therefore, the brain cannot be composed of lots of different bits. I mean, this is nonsense, but this is the kind of argument.
Yeah. And
a poor chap called Broca, who was very Cartesian, that is, he was a follower of Descartes, good Frenchman, he ended up against his will. What he went through is, many scientists have found this, you got a view and then the data push you somewhere you don't want to be. And the experiments you do and everything you do to try and prove these findings wrong, it going the other way and you end up trapped. It's a horrible feeling, but it's also quite exciting. So Broca was convinced that there was no localization of function. But he was working in a Parisian hospital, and he noticed that he had patients who had strokes and who therefore lost the power of speech, or their speech was severely reduced. And he then started dissecting their brains, and he found that whenever one of his patients had lost the ability to speak, then there would be damage, lesions in the front left part of the brain. And his eventual conclusion was, there is localization of function, that speech is controlled by the front left part of the brain, which we now call Broca's area. This is the production of speech. So back to Galen, it's quite interesting. It's the same thing. Right. And poor old Broca is in a double bind. Firstly, because he's just shown that Descartes was wrong. You can't have that. Secondly, Descartes' doubly wrong, because now the brain is not symmetrical. You can't tell by looking at it with the techniques they had at the time. But this part of the brain is doing something different from this part. This part does not control, your front right part of your brain does not control speech. It's this part here. So now it's getting very exciting. It seems that there is localization of function. Some functions are very specifically in particular places.
Yes. Which would have in some way supported the phrenologist
Absolutely.
idea,
Except
right?
they never had, speech here. It would always be things like love or, it's all about emotions or intelligence. All good things were distributed in your brain.
Yeah. I mean, you're right that, it's amazing how popular the view is, but you say that Charles Dickens is one person who may not have been impressed with this, because in Great Expectations, the criminal Magwitch explains that he was subject to a phrenological examination. Before providing a simpler explanation of his behavior, he says, "They measured my head, they had better measured my stomach."
Yeah.
Which is, probably true. I mean, we do now know that, judges are more likely to send someone to jail if they're hungry, for example, which is quite an interesting phenomenon. But okay, so we now it's a weird hodgepodge, isn't it? Because it's like, okay, so some people thought that the brain was responsible for, like, different parts of the brain were responsible for different stuff, and they therefore maybe reasonably thought they could probably feel it through the skull. And it's like, well, they were more right than they could have known about the sort of the different brain regions being responsible for different things. But that other part about the skull anatomy is like total nonsense.
Yeah.
And it's amazing how sort of sometimes on the nose and sometimes not. Although the extent to which the brain is a unified entity versus a sort of specialized system of individual parts is still quite hotly contested.
Oh yeah, very much so. I mean, part of the problem is scientists, in particular those who are studying a particular area, will tend to kind of have a very condensed, short version, kind of elevator pitch to explain things to the public. So this part of the brain controls this or this. And the answer, so that's localization of function. And really you're back with this series of organs, just like in phrenology. Nobody really thinks that, or very few people think that. I mean, scientists, neuroscientists do, but it's the kind of shorthand they would use. But I think the public does end up with this idea that we've got, these bits of my brain, and I've got a left brain and right brain. We can talk about that later on. And I'm a left brain person, I'm a right brain person. And whilst there are asymmetries, like in speech, the brain is both unified and distributed, and consciousness, and all the various other perceptual things that we know about are both localized and distributed. And the localization, certainly animal studies show us that the localization of memories or whatever, or perceptions, and this is where it gets really weird, you can identify a set of for example, if you teach an animal that a particular part of the cage with a particular shape on it is somewhere they're going to get food, then they learn, you've got a representation of, say, the set of stripes that are on the wall. And you can record from cells that show that they fire every time it sees these stripes. If you carry on recording from those cells over the next month, then some of them, a large proportion of them, will stop firing because, in fact, scientists call this representational drift. So you've got a representation, but it's moving in time.
Whoa.
So a different set of neurons are now doing the same thing. So
the same task is sort of just moved in the brain.
Yeah. There'll be some that are still involved, but my guess is that if you left it long enough, then a whole different. This is in a very small scale. It's probably still the same region that's doing it.
It's just, but I can imagine the scientist who first discovers this finally thinking they're beginning to nail down localization, and then they're watching it move, and they're like, not so sure about that.
Yeah. So this representational drift is a very neat kind of phrase, but in fact, it's just kind of these, oh my God. But maybe let's move back to the 19th century, because this is when they start to record. They do two things. They record from electrodes, invented by Arthur Smee, very fine electrodes using batteries that he's developed as well, that mean that you can record from different regions, say, of a monkey's brain. And it's you talk about animal experimentation. Interestingly enough, it was public outcry against some of these, the claimed activity of some of these experimenters that led to the UK's introduction of very stringent restrictions on what you can do with animals in experiments.
Really?
So, yeah, absolutely. So there's always this, this has been a long, long argument. I mean, many countries don't care so much, but you've got to remember in the UK, we have a Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals.
Quite right, yeah.
But we do not have a Royal Society. We have a National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
The RSPCA was founded in the 1830s. The NSPCC was founded in the 1870s. So you're happy to shove children up chimneys,
Wow.
but not to do bad things to animals. So, yeah.
That's quite
So,
incredible.
I mean, that just shows you the British attitudes. But, I mean, I think most scientists working in the UK are very happy with our very strict controls there are on animal experimentation. Anyway, the key point is that you could record from or stimulate different parts of the brain, put electrodes in, and you would stimulate the monkey's brain, and you would be able to show that different parts of the brain were involved, say, in producing movement or in apparently producing the perception of sound. So the monkey's ear, if you put areas in one particular electrodes in one particular area, then the monkey's ear would twitch. And there's also a very famous accident that happened where I've completely forgotten his name.
That's okay. We'll take a minute.
Doesn't matter. We can leave it in. What's his name? Everybody knows his name.
Who are you talking
The
about?
guy who gets the big.
Oh,
I didn't write this down. You see.
no, I've got this.
And if I don't say, it's in the book.
I've got this. It's there's a P in there. Is there a P in there?
See, this is interesting about when you're trying to remember things. It shows you how things are encoded, right?
Do you know what? It's
So, you
incredible.
can see the shape of the word, or it's got a P in it, and that shows you that the thing or the name that you're trying to remember is tagged with all sorts of different bits to it, which you use for retrieving it.
It's there and there somewhere. I think about this all the time. I'm like, one of my favorite things to do when I'm like reflecting. It's less about brain science and more about it's almost like meditation, where I say to people, like, the TV show Friends.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, you could name all of the 5 characters from Friends, right? And I'm like, don't actually focus on, don't do it right now. You know that you could, and yet those names are not actually like present in your head. So that they're like there, but they're not there until you like focus your attention over there. You shine the spotlight on that part of the brain. It's also interesting how like it's that classic thing where if I asked you to name every book you'd ever read, you'd probably get to about 10 and then start forgetting, right? But if I went the other way, if I listed off every single book that you've read, you could tell me instantly whether you'd read it or not. It's like memory kind of works in one way, but not the other. But yeah, there's a guy who got a pole through his head.
It was a big tamping rod. So he's working on a railway cutting, and you drill a hole and you put the charge in, and you put you tamp it in, and then you shout fire in the hole, and you run like hell.
Yeah.
But anyway, it went off and this tamping rod goes right through his.
Don't tell me. I'm gonna remember.
I think this is great. We've got an experiment in real life.
It's perfect. Well, of course, fans of the show will know that I talked about this with Robert Sapolsky. So if you don't know either at home, then you obviously haven't been paying close enough attention either. But yeah, so he's working on the railway, and this pole sort of gets like ejected and just like goes straight through his head in a way that if you looked at it, you'd probably think it killed him. Right?
His skull, his skeleton is still on display in American Medical School.
Yeah.
And it does look like you could never recover from that. And he did recover. And this is where it gets murky. So if you read neuroscience books, classic book, they say, he was no longer a Gage.
Phineas Gage.
Oh, we got there. Man. How about that?
Thank you. Yeah. That's incredible.
Yeah.
But it's like something lit up. It's like, it's so hard to explain. But
I got there by thinking, because the phrase was, gauge was not gauge. That's what was written down. And so I knew, then I was thinking about that, and I got the gauge, and you got the Phineas.
And the rest.
Which has got a P, but it doesn't sound like it.
Yeah, exactly.
So
Which is why
it's
when Alex popped his head over and he went to start telling me, and he went, and I went, don't tell me. And I'm thinking, Fred, Phineas Gage.
Yeah. So the classic story will tell you that Phineas Gage was not Gage. His personality was changed. He became, from being affable and pleasant, he became surly. He became changes in his personality. In fact, all this is very difficult to prove, and there's no evidence of this at the time. It's all kind of retrospective. What is clear is that he did go on to he made a fairly complete recovery. He became a stagecoach driver in Chile. I can't remember all the details. But the idea was, and this corresponded with some of the animal experimentation, that there's, in terms of your will and your confidence and your control over your emotions, that the front part of the brain is extremely important. So we're back to the localization idea. In terms of getting over the idea of localization, then I think the speech is the best one, because this is historically it's the first. It is very clear. You can do it. You can see, I wouldn't do this, but you can see experiments on YouTube where people get big electromagnets, and they're in a scientific situation, and they're speaking away, and they put this electromagnet here, and they can't speak anymore. Take it away, and they're fine.
Yeah, because they sort of send. I don't know what it is they're actually sending.
It's just electromagnet. It's just very strong magnetic field.
And you're talking like literally, like as you're speaking now, they would just place this device on someone's head, and they would start just being unable to
it's just
speak.
slurs, and
it's incredible.
Basically, the strong electromagnetic field is just screwing up all your neurons. I mean, it's temporary. I still wouldn't do it.
I'd love to try that, because presumably the person who's speaking is still cognizant of like what they're trying to say.
Yeah, but it just doesn't come out.
It just doesn't work. I suppose it'd probably be comparable to like being paralyzed or something, where like
absolutely,
you're trying to move your arm, and it just sort of doesn't go. Yeah.
Or maybe it's what people feel when they have a stroke. So viewers, if you feel somebody's face slips and they start slurring their speech, then that two very important signs of one particular kind of stroke. Make sure you get to a physician as soon as possible.
Unless they have a scientist putting a big sort of electric block
then
on
I think
head,
we can exclude that.
Then you might be okay.
So the interesting thing is that is really solid information, localization of speech.
Yep.
And then after I wrote the book, it was about 2-3 years ago, a paper appeared, which was co-produced, as they put it, between some scientists who were doing MRI scans and a woman who was in her 30s. This was in America. She was a secretary. She'd had a college degree and everything. And she wrote to them and said, they put an advert saying, we want to scan people's brains. And she said, I think you might want to scan my brain because people have told me it's quite interesting. So they said, okay, fine, come in. She sat in the scanner, and they look at her brain, and the whole left-hand side of her brain is just black. It's just empty. There's nothing there at all. She only has the right-hand side.
As in, like,
of her brain.
physically, it's not there.
Physically, it is absent. There's a big hole. I mean, it's a big fluid-filled hole in her brain.
Right. But as in, so sorry, but like, as in, there was like a brain there, and it had like a chasm in it, or
her skull's still there, but it's just
the brain matter itself,
the actual matter was just completely absent.
Wow.
So, she knew this because, when she was a child, what they think happened was that before she was born, she had a stroke. So already when she was in the uterus, she had a stroke, and the whole side of that left-hand side of the brain did not develop.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what's interesting is that she's perfectly normal. You would not know if she hadn't at one point in her life had a scan. She would not know there was anything the matter with her. There isn't anything the matter functionally.
Yeah.
So what's happened is the right side of the brain, this what scientists call plasticity. That is the same.
Yeah.
Different brain functions can emerge in different areas. So what that tells us is, although the ability to speak is clearly determined by this structure in normally developed adults, in children and if you've been damaged at that stage, then you can actually overcome that. There are some cases of adults as well who've had very severe strokes, nevertheless recovering virtually complete function. We don't quite understand how that happens beyond say, well, it's plasticity. That's pretty rare, unfortunately. But this woman, and it shows you, so there's nothing that, or rather there's something about being in a spoken environment, having words and language, can be written language, can be sign language, doesn't have to be heard, leads to the development of language processing in the brain.
Right.
We know this from terrible things that happened in the kind of 18th century. As a film about Caspar Hauser. So he's one of these wild children who's been discovered, who's never never heard humans speak, or children who have been locked up by foul parents. And there's what's called a critical period. If you don't learn language before around about your just before your teens, your grasp of language is never going to be very good. Your brain can do it, but not quite the same way. And this relates to why children who've got parents from different nationality to the country they're living in speak 2 languages or more with absolute ease. And you can learn to speak all sorts of languages when you're a child. When you're older, it's much tougher.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So this plasticity is partly a developmental thing. So and that's what happened in the case of this woman. So the answer is speech localized. Yes, it really is localized to the front hand side of the brain, except.
Yeah.
So,
it sort of doesn't have to be exactly.
Yeah, but it has to be. You're only going to get that if you are given that speech function. You've got to have it around. It's something about the environment is making the brain try and make sense of it and then produce a response to it in the same kind. So I say this can be sign language. If you're deaf, it doesn't have to be spoken language.
But it confuses me a little bit to think that, like, okay, so if somebody doesn't have a right hemisphere, or a left hemisphere rather, the right hemisphere can kind of take over that job, implying that, brain function could be localized in different sort of areas of the brain. If that's the case, then why is it that, like, with people who have sort of healthy functional brains, they all develop, the front left side of their brains as the area of speech? Like, why isn't it that, Johnny over here has it in the back right and he has it in the front or whatever?
I have no idea. Nobody else does. I would say because.
Yeah. And so because we're still, well, to put it lightly, we're still pretty perplexed by the functioning of the brain.
Yeah, I mean, this is about language. It's about speech production.
Yeah.
So it's not about language comprehension. There are other parts of the brain that do that. But speech production is very much controlled by this front left part of the brain. And I mean, if we can talk now, if you want, about the amazing, astonishing, mind-blowing stuff that was done in the 1960s about speech production, and the brain.
Yeah.
So these are experiments which were originally done on cats. So what you've got to realize is that your visual field is, you've got your retinas, which is what detecting the light, and basically the left-hand side of both retinas go to the right-hand side of the brain. So basically that means what you see over there is processed here, and then the right-hand side, left hand, which detect the left-hand part of the visual field, go there.
Yeah, so it's sort of the opposite to what you kind of might expect.
Yeah, but they're separated. So if you do a very careful experiment and you only show an image that can be seen by the left-hand side of the brain, then it's only processed over here. Now, they were trying to understand how the brain integrates all this information, and they're working on cats in the 1950s, and because cats are very visual animals, so they've got a nice big visual cortex where all this is processed that you can record from. And they discovered that if they taught the cat, say, that an image in the left-hand part of the visual system was so processed over here, because you're seeing it that
on the right-hand side of the brain.
If you showed that, but you cut the brain in two, then only the right-hand side of the brain was aware of that information. The left-hand side of the brain, if you then tested it by showing the same image in the other visual field, it didn't respond.
It's not seen it before.
It had no idea what that meant.
Yeah.
So the meaning, because you'd given it some food or something, was not being transferred across the two sides of the brain. Okay, that's pretty weird, but things got weirder because they then were working with humans.
Yep.
And these are patients, right? So you've got to remember, these are incredibly generous people. These are patients who suffer from appalling epilepsy and have had operation. They're going to have an operation. They're going to separate the two sides of the brain because epilepsy is kind of a, kind of electrical storm in the brain. And one of the ways of stopping an incredibly bad epileptic fit, a very crude way, is to stop the message from spreading, stop the storm from spreading.
Slice the brain in two.
You cut it in two. And in normal life, these people were absolutely fine. They just got on with their lives and they didn't have as much epilepsy and all the rest of it. So then the experimenters, in particular a young researcher called Mike Gazzaniga, said, well, what if we did an experiment like we did with the cats? And they discovered exactly the same thing. That is, that if they showed something in this side of the visual field, then it went to the right side of the brain, that side went to that side of the brain. So, of course, you can say to the patient, you can show them something over there and say, what do you see? And they'll say, oh, you showed me a picture of a cow. But if you show it over there and you say to the patient, what can you see? They say, well, I can't see anything.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's this side of the brain that's responding.
Yeah.
And it hasn't had that bit of information. It can't see it. So that...
Because the side of the brain that's responding is the left brain, because that's doing
that's
speech.
Controls speech.
But the side of the brain that saw the thing is the right hand
So
side.
That's pretty weird.
Yeah.
That's pretty weird.
Yeah.
But then things got weirder because they then thought, well, they noticed things would happen. So, for example, with one patient, one woman patient, they showed her left-hand side, so seen by the right brain, a picture of a nude woman. And they say to the patient, what can you see? And he goes, you haven't shown me anything. But then she, as far as a woman patient, she started laughing. And they go, well, why are you laughing? And she said, well, you got a funny machine. So she didn't know that the side of the brain that's talking to you does not know that this side has seen something rude in this case. I mean, she blushed and everything, so she had a full response.
Wow.
It was embarrassing to her. But if you talk to this side of the brain, it's the only thing you can get an spoken response from, then you're getting...
I don't know.
I don't know. Some explanation. There's something happening to my body. My body's saying something. Wow. I don't know what it is. So I make stuff up. And they did loads and loads of experiments.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because they don't say... oh, I don't know. They will make up an explanation.
Well, you would do. I mean, if you're, if you're suddenly doing something, you've got to find something to say, right?
Yeah, right.
I mean, why am I laughing? I don't know. It's funny.
Yeah.
So they did loads and loads of experiments, and they found out that basically what's happened is, we know that the brain somehow produces consciousness.
Yeah.
What's happened is they cut the brain in two.
Yeah.
And now they've got two presences, minds, whatever word you want to. And they're different because one can speak because it can control speech. The other can't, but it can move, it understands language, so it can move things around on a board. And can
draw pictures.
Yeah, absolutely. Respond to you in all sorts of ways. And it seemed as well that there was slightly, they've done some really interesting experiments recently. I mean, the great thing is the great and the sad thing is these experiments are coming to a natural end because this all happened.
Yeah.
These operations were done in the 1950s before there were adequate drugs, and these patients are now dying. And of course, there's no way that anybody would do this as an experiment. I mean, this is just too awful. But some of the later experiments they've done more recently suggest that there are actually differences in ethical views. So if they present people with a scenario about somebody tripping up and hitting somebody by accident, the left-hand side of the brain, the one that can speak, is much more likely to say, well, he did that deliberately.
Oh, no.
And the right-hand side of the brain will express the view that actually I understand what's gone on here. So there may be other much more subtle differences between the two sides of the brain that we don't understand. Or it may be, so here's the problem, right? We know that this is actually controlling language, but we've broken the brain in these poor people. We've separated. It's a whole thing. And in some magical way, it has now produced two slightly different functionalities, two slightly different minds, because that's what's happened. Neither one has any idea that the other one exists. Neither one has any conception that things were different beforehand. They don't know. The left-hand brain can't tell you, oh yeah, I used to, be much more sympathetic to people who drop things on my foot. Yeah. It's not like that. They don't understand what's happened at all. And in normal everyday life, they just get on with things. Initially, they would have trouble putting on their trousers because their two arms were doing different things as they were trying to deal with everyday tasks. But very soon, they kind of chilled the two sides of the brain. Yeah. So part of the problem is this looks like, okay, you've got these two sides of the brain and, this ethical aspect. Okay, well, clearly our more ethical view is stuck in the right-hand side of the brain, and a more kind of less empathetic view of human behavior or interpretations would be in the left-hand side of the brain. But that's a mistake, and it's a logical mistake that has troubled both neuroscience and genetics. And it's a method that says, okay, if we break something or we change this particular thing in a system, and something happens, then that element we've altered controls this. Yeah. Whereas if you just think about it, well, wait a minute. So what I was taught when I was a student, this is back in the day, we did have transistor radios, but if you've got a radio or an electric circuit, and you've got a particular component, you could take one component out, and now you get this terrible feedback, and you go, aha, this is the feedback suppressor. Because when I take it out, I get feedback. If I put it in, I don't get feedback. But no, it's actually just part of a system. You've got a whole system, you've broken it, and now it is malfunctioning.
Gotcha. Okay.
So although it's telling it that malfunction tells you about the function of the system, it doesn't necessarily tell you something about that particular component. And this is something that has bedeviled neuroscience. So people take out bits of animals' brain and it behaves differently. They say, aha, this is localization of function. Yeah. Whereas in fact now it's not working properly. Another way of thinking, if you think about a bicycle wheel, you've got a whole set of spokes, and it is going to work really, really well. It's going to carry on. You take a spoke out, it's going to be okay. And another spoke, and another spoke. Yeah. And you go, okay. And then there's going to come a point at which the wheel will fall apart, or it will break on you and you fall off your bike. So there's a change from quantity to quality, and it's a mistake to think, okay, well, spoke number 6.
That was
the one.
Yeah.
You need to, if you take out 6 spokes, then you get a problem. Probably would make a difference as where they were, I guess, as well, if you think about it,
But it's complicated, and it's not as simple. Yeah. And so, because in the face of, and I've spoken about these split brain patients a lot, like our listeners. Yeah. Most of the people listening to this who've seen this show before will probably have heard of these experiments, because I talk about
they
them
are extraordinary
all the time. When I first, it was Ian McGilchrist, I read The Martian's Emissary, and since that day I have not stopped talking about it. It's like on my bingo card of things that I talk about all the time. But like the natural sort of reaction to this is to think, okay, we can experimentally test in split brain patients and show that the sort of brains are sort of split in two. And that in healthy sort of functioning brains, where the corpus callosum is still intact, like they're communicating with each other, but the same thing's still going on. We just can't experimentally test absolutely. It. But we have to be careful to say such a thing.
That's almost certainly not the case.
Right.
So the two sides are talking to each other all the time, forming a whole. Yeah. Whatever consciousness is, it's emerging out of the whole brain. And the fact that it can emerge in a different way in the two halves of the brain is telling us something, but I don't know. Yeah,
because I was thinking the other day I was going to make a series of sort of novel arguments against the existence of God, just like funny ones, a Christmas video. And one of the ones I thought was like, well, if your brain is split into two hemispheres, both of which kind of have their own centers of consciousness and their own awareness of different things, and what if you convinced one of them of Islam and one of them of Christianity? Would that person get to go to heaven or not? And I don't think that religious traditions have sort of adequately accounted for that. But I suppose in a split brain patient, you could kind of do that.
My guess is that religious scholars of all religions, if you pose them the problem of what's happened to the soul in these individuals, they would have an answer. I don't know what it would be. Whether have you got two souls? Have you just got one that is slightly different? Or do we just go with the one that can speak and say the prayers or whatever?
It could be comparable to someone who's like, on Monday they're feeling pretty religious and then on Tuesday they're not. It's like, what happens to that person? Well, they're kind of both of those people at once, even though it sort of changes a little bit over time. Maybe it changes over space too. But it does, it massively upsets, like, a lot of our understanding about, like, let's say personhood or the unity of the self, right? Because we've got, at least in these specific circumstances, people who, for all intents and purposes, act like a single person. And yet there's sort of a little bit more going on. So, and yet when you connect them back up again, the brain starts sort of, it's like completing a circuit and the whole thing starts working together again. And the brain is in two hemispheres, even without the split brain hemispheres. That the brain is built in sort of two parts, and there seems to be an evolutionary advantage to that because it happens across different animals. So then, what is the relevance of this separation of two hemispheres in a brain that is connected up properly?
It's one of the. It's not just the brain, of course. We are symmetrical.
Right,
not entirely. So you've got one heart, not two, unless you're from Gallifrey. You got one heart. You got one liver. So it's not entirely symmetrical, but we are bilaterally symmetrical organisms. And one of the mysteries, one of the things we don't fully understand, is that the evolution of bisymmetry. Of symmetry, of bilateral symmetry, occurs at the same time as what's called cephalization. Because if you think about it, you are most definitely not symmetrical that way. You've got a head
from top to bottom,
and you've got feet.
That's interesting.
And you've got a front and a back, right? So in two of the key dimensions, you are most definitely not symmetrical. And what happened around about 550 million years ago is that scientists can't define the brain, but let's just say it's a load of neurons. You've developed not only this cephalization, so the development of this putting neurons together at the brain, also goes with the development of a mouth and an anus, because that's the other thing you've got. It goes in one end, it comes out the other. And the sense organs are tending to be accumulating at one end. And this enables you to be symmetrical, because it enables you to detect where food's coming from or where a threat is coming from. Because I'm here, and so I can see that, or sense the stronger sense if the predator's coming from over here. I can feel the vibrations in this neuron, this set of neurons, more so than in this set of neurons.
Right.
So then you tend to, in evolutionary terms, you end up with these neurons all kind of being stuck together. So the symmetry is probably, and it's a deep developmental, an evolutionary developmental thing that's going to be related to our various earliest origins as animals that are becoming bilaterally symmetrical and cephalized, and also with our, we have a spine, we're dorsal. We have a dorsal nerve cord, whereas if you are an octopus or a fly, then your nerve cord is ventral, it's down your tummy. So there's a complete separation of the animal kingdom that occurred very early on with these two different ways of organizing yourself, which are, the big difference is that if you just think about it, I've got my throat here and my brain there, and all my neurons are going down past the back side of my throat.
Right.
Whereas if you're an octopus or a slug, and that's all octopuses are, apologies to Peter Godfrey Smith, they're just smart slugs, or you're a fly or a bee, then you've got your brain here, and because your nerve cord is ventral, it's got to go round your throat. So basically you have a brain that's kind of like a donut shape, 'cause it's got to go round your throat, basically, and then it goes down the front of your body.
Yeah.
So the short answer, I think that the symmetry is a consequence of those developmental steps that were taken deep in animal history. And that's why all animals have got symmetrical brains.
And so then today, what do these symmetrical brains do for us? If it seems like you're sort of saying most of the time in a healthy brain, the whole brain is active, and yet we can kind of localize certain activities, and some of those localized activities will be on one side or the other. Like we've said a few times that, the processing of spoken language, for example, is in the front left of the brain. But at the same time, you probably want to say, but that's too simplistic. That's like an overview. But then what's the actual answer? Where is speech stored if not there?
Well, I mean, control of speech is stored, is there. That's to do with that. And that's why if you have a stroke there, as Broca discovered, you are likely to lose the power of speech.
Yeah.
You still understand it, you could write it, but you can't speak.
So in that case, at least the left hemisphere could be said to do speech.
Yeah.
Well, the right hemisphere, they're not to,
They're
right?
doing something else.
And that is quite a division, even in a healthy, functioning brain that's communicating with itself. I know it would be a fallacy, perhaps, to assume that in a healthy brain, like there are sort of two centers of consciousness exactly. But do we have sort of good reason to the contrary, or should we remain sort of like agnostic? Like, could we look at that?
I don't think there's any evidence for that at all. No, I mean, quite the opposite, that whatever consciousness is, it's emerging from the brain or parts of the brain as a whole. And even when you try and... So there's this argument about localization of function is still going on. I mean, on the train down, I was reading a new big review all about how cognition is both distributed and localized.
Yeah.
And it changes over time. One of the things that I tried to do in the book is partly because, so though I have a degree in psychology, I spent all my academic career studying insects. So took a kind of reductionist approach. Let's see if we can understand simple systems.
Yep.
So, for example, a big study just came out looking at a tiny little worm called C. elegans, which has got about 1,000 cells, 300 neurons.
Wow. So
its brain is about 8 cells. So we know everything about these animals, absolutely everything. And they just did a huge study of looking at the recording from all the neurons, all 302 neurons, whilst the animals were doing various things, wriggling about, turning, finding food, very, very simple things. And you might imagine, if you're building a robot, you say, okay, well, I can make it, you could make a robot do that. You could get a robot that could detect a particular stimulus and then move to a particular place where it can find that solution. And your computer would have functions hardwired into the components. But what the animal does is those neurons are doing all sorts of things, and those things change. Their functions will change over time. Some of them are paying attention to past states. Some of them are just interested in what's happening at the minute. If you go back and test the animal again, it's going to be different sets of neurons, even in such a simple thing. So it is really, really hard to understand how this is happening in our brains.
Yeah.
Now, there is a counter-argument that is, I think is quite interesting. Somebody put to me the other day that, okay, so what you're saying is that identifying it at kind of the atomic, the atom, the particular level of neurons is going to be really hard. But do we need to do that? So climate change is a reality. We don't understand how every atom of air is moving about in the wind, where we deal with much larger scale problems. And I think that's a good argument. And I think that's, large scale studies of brain function, and in particular in humans, who are very interesting, obviously, to us and present the most complicated case, are absolutely valid. And I don't think that's not something that's worth doing or anything like that. But there is the weird thing about the brain. So consciousness, if it's anywhere, is thought to be in the outer layers of the brain, in the cortex.
Yep.
And in particular, there's bits at the back of the brain called the cerebellum, which, as far as we can tell, they're controlling movement and gait and all the rest of it, but they don't seem to be involved in consciousness. So we've got some neurons, I mean, bazillions of them, and not just the neurons. I mean, all we talked about is neurons. You've got to remember, we've got 80 billion neurons in our brains, but there are also things called astrocytes, which envelop the neurons. There's the chemicals that they're all flopping around in, the hormones and all the rest. So it's a really complicated system.
Yeah.
But it's just those structures, some structures are producing thought somehow, and others aren't. What's different? I mean, I said I'd just finished writing this biography of Francis Crick, and one of the things that he was interested in was finding what he called the neural correlates of consciousness.
Yes.
Which is not the same as this is what consciousness is or where it is, but we can find a set of neurons that are responding whenever a particular thought or perception is taking place.
Yeah, the neural correlates so like what correlates in the neurons with the conscious experience.
Yeah, absolutely. So that doesn't mean, there may be that, because it's a correlation, that is something else that they're both involved in, but it's a start. And his questions are very useful. He said, well, where are these neurons? Is there anything special about them in terms of their structure or the genes they express? Or is there anything special about them in terms of how they're firing or how they're connected up? Those are the questions we need to answer. And I think whilst the climate change argument is good, we can't get away from the fact that ultimately, whatever consciousness is, it is emerging from the properties of these incredibly complicated neural networks that are in our brain and are communicating on the two sides.
Mm-hmm. And you don't place much stock in the idea that, you know how the debate originally would have been about, are there certain parts of the brain that are responsible for certain behaviors like speech or the left-hand side of my sort of pinky finger or something? Is that different areas in the brain and memory? Do you think there's a similar debate to be had about, like, are different parts of the brain responsible for different sort of parts of consciousness? Like, there's your emotional self and your rational self and your sleeping self, and maybe there's like different parts of the brain, or do you take what I suppose would be a more Cartesian view philosophically that it's all like one thing?
I think it would be terribly mealy mouthed. Well, a bit of one and a bit of the other.
Right.
So, in this review I was just talking about, it was characterized. The extreme position is, cognition and ideas and thinking is everywhere, everything, everywhere, all at once.
Yeah.
That's the extreme view. It's all going on, man. But I've already indicated it's not everywhere because the cerebellum doesn't seem to be involved. But it is, on the other hand, both all I can say is it's both distributed and localized, but the localization, as I say, is fuzzy. And where we can really identify localization of perception, it moves at a cellular level. And this is kind of mind-boggling. So I think what people have to realize is that simple neural networks remain a mystery to us. We might think that it should be relatively straightforward. An example, but it isn't. The example I give is the work of Eve Marder. And she spent the whole of her career, she's still active, studying the lobster's stomach. And the lobster's stomach is a bag that has got lots of muscles in it that grinds its food up. And there are around about 30 neurons controlling the activity of these muscles. And the muscles do two rhythms. And Dr. Marder knows everything about those neurons. She can dissect them with both scalpels and chemistry and genetics. She can model their activity, and yet she cannot explain why the 30 neurons produce those two rhythms and not other rhythms. When models suggest that they should be able to do something else. She can't predict either what will happen if she takes out one of those ablates in the technical term. You remove stop one of those neurons being active, what happens to the rest? The network starts breaking down. Now, on one level, this isn't surprising. Physicists have something called the three-body problem, whereby they can predict accurately using Newton's laws the motion of two objects in space, but then randomly moving around each other, but then if you add a third one, it all gets chaotic and they can't predict what's going to happen. Mm-hmm. So we know that very simple systems can produce very odd kind of behaviors.
Right.
So if we don't understand the lobster's stomach, poor old Dr. Marder can't, figure it out. And it's not because she's far cleverer than I am. And she had loads of researchers working with it. It really is a massive, massive problem. We can see some of this in an object that excited in years after the First World War, as ideas about information and code started to emerge, long before the development of computers. It all emerges from messages being sent during the First World War, which is also when they started to use radio, of course, and had amplifiers, these which could amplify weak signals. People then start to record from neurons and start to say, then it's not just a message, it's a code that's going down the neuron. There's information in there. Somebody's writing a popular book about behavior and so on. There's a man called Lotka, who's mainly known as an ecologist. And he had a little wind up, what in the UK we call a ladybird, a ladybug in the US. And this shows an incredible emergent behavior. I can look. Do you want to do? You could maybe record it. I've got a.
You've got one with you.
Yeah, so we need to put it on a leg.
Oh, we're so.
And it moves a lot, and it is amazing. I mean, I've done it in display.
So when's this from?
Well, this is a reproduction. So it's a retro. There you go.
Yeah. Okay, I see. Because these were popular when?
In the 1920s. Uh-huh. So it's entirely clockwork, right? You've got to remember it's entirely clockwork. There's nothing electronic in here. It's got those little wheels. I've just wound it up. Give it another wind. It's got these antennae that move at the front.
Sure.
And
is this big enough?
Yeah, it's fine. Well, we'll see. Okay, I'm going to put it down, and it's going to go straight forward, and then we'll see what happens. Look at that.
That is crazy.
So it looks purposive.
Isn't that cool?
And it really is quite an extraordinary kind of thing. Okay, shall I show you? I'll show you how it works.
Yeah.
I'll stop it making the noise now. I'll hold it. So it's got the friction motor, the wind-up motor.
Yeah.
And this are the key thing. Okay.
Yep.
So this little wheel here, if you can see it in profile.
Yep.
That's a freewheel, and it's at an angle. And these little antennae keep the whole thing. I don't know if you can see it in profile. Mm-hmm. You imagine this is not quite as deep. So normally, when the antennae are both down, it keeps this out of contact, so that it just goes straight forward.
Yep.
But when the antennae drop, them like that, as it goes off, then this comes into contact. The little freewheel comes into contact, and because it's at an angle, it will now turn the motion from a forward motion into a sideways motion.
I see. So having a look at this down here.
Poor
Alex is trying his best here as well. Yeah, it's still rolling. So what will happen is that antenna will sort of
as it falls off the edge.
We'll call it to fall, and it'll hit that wheel.
Yeah,
and that wheel will essentially
moves,
steer it around.
Yeah.
Right, and so wherever
it's always going to go the same
It
direction.
will stay on the table.
Yeah, turn right. It's always going to turn the same direction. If it was angled at the other direction, it would go the other way.
Yeah, that's pretty.
Okay, so what what did we just? I mean, that's pretty neat, a pretty cool, Christmas or birthday present, perhaps. But why is that relevant to brain science?
Well, what it's showing is one, you can get what looks like purposive behaviour out of a very simple system. Here we've got. I mean, there's no electrical communication or anything like that. It is simply the way it is organised. Yep. It's set up to be able to produce something. So the one thing people should take away from that is just because it looks like it's purposive doesn't mean to say it is. And the same is true when you talk to ChatGPT.
Right.
Just because it's giving you some advice, that doesn't mean to say it understands anything. Humans are very bad at being suspicious about things.
Yeah.
We tend to assume, and we have to, right? This is part of what is called theory of mind. That is, we have to assume that other human beings feel the same things and think the same way as we do. I mean, they are basically human. I mean, clearly at times, war, conflict, then we pretend they're not and we dehumanize them. And so they are other and they must be killed or whatever. But in general, human society works on the basis that I assume that you're not a robot from Mars. You're not a figment of my imagination. I mean, I can't prove either of those things, of course. That is possible, but very unlikely and not terribly interesting at the end.
Yeah.
But so we assume that other humans think that way. We also assume our pets do. Everybody, my dog. Of course it's conscious, But that's simply because you're projecting, I mean, it may be, but it's you projecting onto the animal. Same with when I was at work, I used to shout at the photocopier.
Yeah.
So there's no point in no Basil Fawlty thrashing the car because you treat it as a thinking object. So the key point is that shows what appears to be purposive behavior. But then you've got to think about, well, what is happening there? Okay, I understand how it's set up. And what Lotka argued is that the whole device, it's the whole thing that functions. It needs to have all those parts, and the device as a whole is somehow construing, he put it, construing the information from the little antennae that it's now out. If you think about it as a functioning system, then that is the way it's working. But there's no actual transmission of information. It's simply an alteration of the structure. So whilst we can understand how that very simple robot works, understanding a real 30 neuron system in the lobster's stomach or a 302 neuron worm wriggling around, for the moment, that remains beyond us. But there's something about the organization of things, their structure, which enables particular functions to emerge.
Yeah.
And that is the same in the case of the brain and consciousness. But that is at the moment unknowable. Now, I don't think it is forever unknowable, but I mean, it's partly because I don't work in the area, so I'm not kind of despairing at trying to figure it out.
Sure.
And I mean, opinions differ over this. So, studies of consciousness. When I was an undergraduate in the 1970s, I remember us sitting around, and it's partly because Francis Crick had just stopped working on molecular biology and so on, and had gone to America to work on neuroscience, and he was going to study consciousness, and we knew this, and we kind of laughed and said, "Oh yeah, he's going to crack consciousness." Oh yeah, and so we then said, "Well, what do we think consciousness is?" And we said, "Well, it's some kind of emergent property of the brain, and that's it. Right. How could we study it? No idea." So I've never worked in this area. Crick was much more precise and more thoughtful than I was as a young man, and came up with this idea of we can try and find the correlates of the neural correlates of consciousness. But he was very limited in what he was trying to do. He wanted to come up with a very precise hypothesis that could then be tested experimentally. And my impression of the field of consciousness studies in particular, although he helped make it a thing, he turned it into a popular scientific, and acceptable, let's put it that, a respectable scientific activity, not simply something to be left to the philosophers who've been thinking about it for, whatever it is, 3,000 years and haven't got anywhere. Right, we can now work it out. Now, they haven't, and things have got really complicated. So the most recent article, I think, suggested there were over 250 different theories of consciousness.
Yeah.
Which, to me, says you don't know what you studied.
I know the guy from Closer to Truth. I've forgotten his name. It's like a TV show that's also on YouTube. I think he and maybe some other people have just produced this like interactive map. And this is, I think, probably more like philosophical theories of consciousness. But you can either see it as like a connective map or like as a big list. And it's this, I don't know if it's the same list that we're talking about.
I think it is.
It's like hundreds of them. And you can click on them all. And there's, I'll link in. I think it's awesome. I mean, it takes forever just to get through them. But it is also in a way a little bit depressing.
Yeah, but it shows we don't know what we're talking about, right? Because they can't agree what. I mean, most of those studies don't. I mean, the scientific versions don't try and say, okay, well, our version is better because we predict X and your theory doesn't predict that. Right? They don't, that doesn't happen. They all kind of work in separation. It's the beginning of a change in that respect. But above all, they're theories of everything. They're theories that try to explain everything all at once. Sure. And Crick, and I tend to follow him on this, his view was that was the wrong way to go. We needed to do it very piecemeal and just try it, getting there. Now, that having been said, his and his colleague Christoph Koch, their search for neural correlates of consciousness, in a way we found them. Okay, so one of the things that Koch did after Crick's death, in conjunction with some neuroscientists, some neurosurgeons in Los Angeles, Ishak Fried, main researcher, they were again working on patients who had terrible epilepsies. So they were going to be operated on. They weren't having their brains split or anything. But these incredibly generous people said, yes, of course you can poke around in my brain and record from my cells in my brain whilst I'm getting prepped for the op. So they're amazingly generous.
Yeah,
right? And I think it always goes, wow. Anyway, so they're going to have an operation that's going to do various things to their brain to reduce their risk of epilepsy, very, very severe epilepsy. And what they did was to record from single cells in the brain and the visual processing areas, and they would show them images and they would show them a picture of the Sydney Opera House or of a differential equation or of Jennifer Aniston. And they would find cells that only responded to those very specific images.
Mm-hmm.
In the case of Jennifer Aniston, notoriously, there was one patient who had a cell that responded to Jennifer Aniston, but would not respond if there was Jennifer Aniston and Brad Pitt. So,
Right.
you know, these were neural correlates of consciousness. This was their visual. They were saying, okay, it's Brad Pitt. That's a Sydney Opera House. That's a differential equation.
Yeah.
And this single cell, one cell,
Yeah.
is firing away. Now, this is a bit of a cheat, or it's not a cheat. It's a problem of optics. So they're recording from single cells. Wow, that's amazing. Is that the only cell in their brain that represents Jennifer Aniston? Almost certainly not.
Mm-hmm.
What it will be is, you can imagine, I mean, in a way, all it's saying is, well, our perception's the activity of neurons. That's all there is. You know,
Right.
there's nothing else except neurons, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But what it goes against, I mean, clearly we cannot have a single cell for every possible thing we could remark, we
Right.
could detect.
Yeah.
Our brains aren't big enough, you know, because we can see all sorts of things. I can see you, I can see the cameras,
Yeah.
see the chair.
You can
whatever.
also see like Jennifer Aniston's left ear,
Yeah.
and you know, like you can.
Yeah. I mean,
split
Jennifer
that.
Aniston standing on her head, is that the same
Yeah,
as Jennifer? You know, clearly, then have we got two cells for that?
Right.
You heard a left profile. It clearly is bonkers. And what there must be is, you're going to have a set of neurons that would recognize blonde woman in her 30s, and then another set which would actually be much more specific of actually Jennifer Aniston. And they were recording by chance from one of those cells. I mean, you know, that cell responded to Jennifer Aniston, nothing else. Quite possibly it's part of this network. You can't go to the same place in the different patients, because our brains are so dense. And what that representational drift business I was talking about much earlier on suggests, if the same is true in humans as it is in mice, which my guess is that it is, that if you were to leave that electrode in place and to come back a month later and show the picture of Jennifer Aniston, maybe that cell wouldn't fire. Not because the patient didn't know who Jennifer Aniston was, but because those 1,000, say, cells had now moved on somewhere else in the brain. Just they're shifting for reasons we don't understand.
Yeah, that's
So,
incredible.
yeah, we've got neural correlates, and then what? It hasn't actually. I mean, so Crick and Cobb, this was their big thing. I think they were really. This is the best approach, but we're kind of stuck. I mean, that's really the theme of the book, and it struck me when I was. You know, they were all in the 2010s. There were all these think pieces by neuroscientists saying, well, we've got all these data from what are called connectomes, how neuron brains are wired together, all this other information. We can't make sense of it. We got too much data and not enough theory to try and explain what should be going on.
Right, I see. And okay, I know it's a big topic and you've got a whole chapter on it, but just as an overview, we've used the word neuron a few times now, neuron, and people might sort of roughly know that that's what the brain is made out of. But what is a neuron?
Well, it's a cell. It's a cell. It's a responsive cell with normally an input at one end and an output at the other end. And there's the dendrites, as they're called, which are loads and loads of the input part. And then there's the cell body, which has got a nucleus, enables it to function. And then you've got a long thing called an axon, which sends the message on to the next part of the processing network. And these neurons, these specialized cells, are they will interact with each other. So for example, in one of the, again, to show how amazingly complex simple organisms are, people have studied the cell wall of a maggot. So a maggot basically wriggles along, and it's got a repeated nervous system in there which enables us to do this. And you've got little cells that say, I've stretched. They respond to stretching. So when the maggot pushes forward, these cells stretches, and it's basically telling the system, okay, I've stretched, don't go any further, we'll burst. We've got to now stop stretching and do the next kind of movement. And those single cells that are simply saying, I've stretched, not even to the maggot's brain, but to a little movement circuit, they have around about 100, they have about 130, connected to 132 other cells. And those connections are not like in an electric circuit where it's just a plus or minus, they will have many, many neurotransmitters, because that's how the chemical electrical signal is transmitted from one cell to the other through these chemical connections. And we have lots of different neurotransmitters in the same system that can do more than one thing. So they can modulate the activity, turn the next neuron off and turn it on, excite it or whatever. So it is not a series, it's not like a computer. I mean, it's so unlike a computer. It is not a digitally based system.
Right.
In that if you shine a light on a cell that can detect light, it doesn't just go on and then go off. It will fire with greater intensity with more light. And things get they're even more complicated. It can show changes in the shape over time as well.
Yeah.
So neurons are basically kind of the connecting parts of the nervous system. And when they're in brains, when they're in connection networks, they start to do very complicated things that we, as I've tried to explain, we've found very hard to understand. And somehow, some of those neurons in your brain right now are producing your perception, your thoughts.
Yeah.
And that intangible, weird, spooky thingness that's consciousness. And how that happens, I have no idea. And anybody who tells you that they have an idea is talking crap. When I finished the first draft of the book, I sent it to my editor, and he sent back, he said, well, this is all very well, it's very clever and all that, but how does the brain work? And I said, well, we have no idea. And he said, we can't say that. Every book about the brain explains how it works. It's quantum this, or it's whatever, it's computer, whatever.
Yeah.
And I said, yeah, but all that's rubbish. I mean, that's just to sell books.
Yeah.
Maybe I said, the USP, the unique selling point of my book would be that I tell the truth, but we do not know.
Yeah, it's the publisher thing, isn't it? Like, publishers are very keen on like in the world of philosophy, publishers will sort of say, this book's it's a cool idea, but like really love for you to just like do a chapter on like, how to find meaning, in your life and stuff. And you're sort of like, I'm not quite sure you understand the project.
Yeah.
But, I understand you've got to sell books. And I think people are beginning to get a bit tired of that as well. I think if you walk into a Waterstones and you see all of the new books, and they're all very certain. They're all very like, here are like 14 principles to follow that will fix all of your problems, or here is the explanation for this or that or whatever, or like a comprehensive history of the world in like 18 screwdrivers or something, and it's cool.
Hey, I'll buy that. That sounds great.
It's interesting, right? But I think it needs to be presented as this is my theory, my idea, and it needs to be tested against the evidence. And as a historian, right, which is the sort of cap that you're putting on when writing a text like this, it's not your job to say.
Well, except I don't have. I mean, I don't have a dog in the many fights, and I don't work on the brain, right? But I am, or was until I retired, a neuroscientist. So I'm both. So I can see, and what I also wanted to do was not simply to tell the story and say, look, we've no idea, let's go home, but quite the opposite, to actually sketch out, these are the possible futures.
Yeah.
So I sometimes say facetiously, the book's divided into three halves: past, present, and future. And the future bit, again, I didn't want to write that. So there's a future is the final section where I try and predict what's going to happen, which is not something that scientists do, or historians, right? It's just, but the publisher said, we really need that. You've got to say, where are we going? So I said, okay, well, predictions are mug's game, especially about the future, but I'll try. And so that was really interesting to try and think, well, what are we going to discover? How could it be done? And I there lay out my own kind of prejudices, which I've outlined here, which tend to be more about understanding simple systems in the hope that something of the principle of organization can emerge that we can then apply to more complicated things. In other words, I would largely, personally, put the problem of consciousness and how it works and how it emerges on the back burner until we've got some better idea. I mean, very famously, Christoph Koch had a bet with David Chalmers, who's the philosopher who came up with the idea of the hard problem, i.e., what are called qualia, why I feel what the feeling of consciousness is.
Mm-hmm.
And Cobb, very ambitiously, this is in 1998, I think, bet him a case of fine wine that within 25 years we'd have solved this problem. He lost, very graciously.
Yeah.
But I mean, I my view, what I normally point to stuff I know about. So the maggot brain, I spent most of my career studying, as I say, tiny insects, maggots, very simple systems. We have the connectome of the maggot brain, which is about 5,000 neurons, something like that. If in a century we can predict everything that can do and say, okay, we take out these neurons or alter their activity in this way, this is what the animal will do, and we understand everything about it, I will be amazed. And that is and I think these, whilst many people think, well, okay, well, this is insects, we don't care about that. What about the heart problem or wherever? I mean, the reality is that we aren't going to, unless we can solve the other problems, I don't think we're going to be able to solve the big problem. And we've seen this. So this has happened repeatedly. Every kind of breakthrough we've made since the 1870s, been a huge breakthrough, say, in discovery of electrical activity in the brain and some localization of function. And then people go, oh my God, how are we ever going to figure out how consciousness emerges? My God, if it's not some mystical spirit, which is just a get out, all right? If you think it is a material thing that is a consequence of neuronal activity, how are we going to explain that? Same thing happened in the 1950s when they developed the first EEG recordings. So you can record from the overall activity of the brain. And this looked fantastic, great insight. You could record from or stimulate bits of the brain and you'd get people remembering things, most bizarre things like, oh, I can see my mother telling me off because I've put my duffel coat on upside down or whatever. And most bizarre things. Or people got earworms. They started singing along because they could hear a tune being played.
Wilder Penfield?
Yeah, that's right. Wilder Penfield.
Sort of discovers this.
Yeah. And again, working patients and recording and stimulating their brains and getting as they were being operated on for other reasons. These weren't experiments in that sense.
And these patients would literally, if the right part of their brain was stimulated, they would literally just hear a piece of piano music or it's difficult to understand exactly because they sort of describe it as almost like a very intense dream or something, but it's like they relive. Like I can hear a piano note in my head. I can hear someone's voice. I can sort of remember what I did this morning, but to actually sort of re-experience what I did this morning.
I could make you do that. I would have to know what the trigger was, as it were.
Right.
So I could do that with the sense of smell.
Right.
So if you think of Proust's À la recherche du temps perdu, so in Remembrance of Things Past is the most used English translation.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a huge long book about experience and so on. It begins with him saying, I used to go to bed quite early and my mother would bring me a Madeleine, one of these nice biscuits, and she'd dunk it in the tisane, in the wheat tea that he would eat, and he remembers this because he's doing this, and the smell and the taste of the food takes him back. And we've all had that. You smell, I don't know, a particular food that your grandmother used to cook, and you remember it like you're back there. She's up here, you're that height, and the counter's at this height. You're 3 years old in the kitchen as she's cooking, something like that. So smell is in fact very able to produce these dreamlike, very realistic memories that are not the same as us struggling for the name of Phineas Gage or whatever. It's rather different. There's no tip of the tongue phenomenon. Bang, you are there. You can remember it.
Do we know why smell is so connected to memory?
Well, as we're experiencing things, it seems that, again, this is partly because a lot of what we know comes from animal studies and then from a few patients. But we know that we are tagging events, key events, tend to get tagged with smells that are associated in the environment, but also with place. And we can manipulate this in animals. So, for example, you can make an animal remember a smell that it's never smelled. So if you know the particular set of neurons in a mouse's brain that are activated by stimulating the smell of aniseed or something, and then you will make it you will make it respond to that by stimulating those areas, activating them using optogenetics or whatever. So you can actually reconstruct bits of memory that have never happened.
Yeah, that's strange.
I mean, it's in an animal. We can't do this in humans, but
right.
Clearly, science fiction. Philip K. Dick's, talked about this. We can remember it for you wholesale. It's just turned into a film and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
So memories, I mean, they can't be plugged in. Elon Musk wants to get get a language module, and you stick it in, and all of a sudden you can speak Italian or whatever, or you can remember things that about quantum physics that you were never taught. That's not going to happen. Brain-computer interfaces don't work that way, and I don't think ever will. But there is this tagging of events that are taking place, and smell, partly because it's one of the oldest, it's the oldest sense. So it's the one that evolved. It's just detecting chemicals in the environment.
Right? Sure. Yeah, of course.
So you can smell in water, fish smell. Right?
Yeah,
so
right.
we were smelling long before we had eyes, right? We were detecting chemical gradients in the environment and be moving, our long ago ancestors, little worm-like things. So smell and memory are very closely linked. And in humans, memory is partly one of the gateways to it. The way that memory is then stored is through these structures called the hypothalamuses, which are deep down in our brain. And again, one of the experiments that went wrong, this was studied by Wilder Penfield and Brenda Milner, who is astonishingly still alive, and I think she published she's about 103, she's a Canadian psychologist. One of these patients called HM, that was his real name, is because he's dead now, and so his name's been revealed, was Henry Mollison. These patients were having an operation because they had terrible seizures and so on, and basically the surgeon who did it was a hacker, and I mean, as he just kind of hacked around, and he drilled huge holes through the brain and destroyed. It was supposed to be simply taking out small areas, and basically destroyed HM's memory system in that he could not form any new permanent memories after that day, pretty much. So what that meant was that he knew everything that happened up until he had the operation, but every day he lived it anew. He couldn't remember anything. So Brenda Milner worked with him for decades, did experiments on him, trying to work out. His olfactory system was also damaged. He couldn't identify smells anymore. He found it very difficult to navigate, to read maps and so on. But she did all these tests on him, and every time she had to introduce herself.
Yeah.
Hello, Henri. I'm here to do some experiments. Oh, that'd be great. Love to help you.
Yeah.
And of course, she knew that she knew him, and he had no idea. Now, it's interesting that it doesn't seem to have been completely, his isolation, a terrible, terrible isolation. Can you just imagine? You don't know anything from this event in 1952 or 1951 when the operation happened. But he could later on. So, for example, he knew about the Beatles. He mentioned them. He knew about landing on the moon. So this awful, awful operation, botched operation, didn't completely destroy his memory, but you had to, there are only very, very few things that escaped the destruction of these two structures in his brain. And we're back to the problem of, what does this mean? Does it mean that the hippocampuses are the site of memory, or rather that this, more likely it seems, this is the place through which memory is then rooted?
That jumps out at me.
Yeah, it seems to be much more likely that it's the latter. Memories are distributed. So I said earlier on, this perceptual drift is not happening in the hippocampus, it's happening elsewhere, perception and so on.
Yeah, it's sort of like, and that original operation that you're talking about, wasn't it someone who, I mean, you're talking about a lobotomy, and this was at a time when it was a self-admittedly experimental sort of form of medicine, and this guy had been sort of trying to treat people with schizophrenia, and then this, like, Henry was having like epileptic seizures, and he kind of just tried the same technique, even though it was dubious in the schizophrenia case too, and he just sort of destroys part of this guy's brain. And the idea that, the hippocampus is clearly key to memory here, but to think that must mean that that's where memory is done or where it's stored it's like maybe a bit like sort of if I like plastered over the front door of a house and there's no way to get into the house anymore. And when like, oh look, I can't get into the living room anymore. You know, that the living room must be sort of stored in the front door. It's like a sort of the wrong way of thinking about it. But we know that the hippocampus is incredibly important. And there's again I wanted to ask you about this because I think it's dubious, but I'm not sure how dubious it is. The London cabbies thing, like black cab drivers in London have bigger hippocampuses, but they've not been able to replicate that test, right?
Yeah, well, it hasn't been replicated. I don't know if anybody's tried. I mean, so this is the issue. So in animals, the hippocampus is associated with place, identifying place.
Yep.
And there are these things called place cells, which very carefully, very exactly tell a rat or a mouse where it is in the environment, and events are tagged with that. So if you find a bit of food in that corner, then those cells are really, really activated because that was great. Now, those cells have not been shown to exist in humans.
Really?
Now, we're not rodents. So, part of the problem is you've got an animal model that you know so much about, and you then extrapolate because they're both mammals, but we don't know that they're place cells.
They're in the hippocampus.
Yeah, they're in the
hippocampus,
animals,
right?
Absolutely, yeah. They were discovered by accident. They got a Nobel Prize for it, but they did discover it. They were looking for something else.
Because it wasn't, I can't remember like who it was or anything, but this experimenter was trying to sort of measure a part of this like mouse or rat's brain. And then as the rat's moving around, it's lighting up like crazy. And they're like, gosh, something crazy must be happening. And it turns out they just accidentally stuck it in the hippocampus.
Yeah, well, they only knew that after they chopped the rat up.
Yeah, right.
Oh, where were we? Oh, we weren't there. Okay, that's interesting. So maybe it's the hippocampus.
Yeah.
But, I mean, clearly something similar is happening. We've got some way of encoding space. I mean, I have a very good sense of direction. And in general, when I know where I am, and if I don't know where I am, I find it very disorienting. I can, I know in London, I know I go down, Charing Cross Road, and I'm going to end up at Trafalgar Square. My wife, she comes out of the tube. She doesn't know it. She has a very different sense of direction to me. So we know that the hippocampus is involved in this kind of activity, and there is this claim from this study in London that taxi drivers who have to do what's called the knowledge. So if you get in a London cab, they're not going to use sat-nav.
Yep.
You're going to say, I want to go to Golders Green or whatever, and they will take you there, and they'll take you by the quickest route and all the rest of it, because they have to learn it. You've got to learn the name of every street in central London.
You can watch them doing it on YouTube where like they're doing the test, and someone will sit there and go, okay, give me like King's Cross Station to, somewhere in Shoreditch. And they sit there and they go, right, you take a left down this street, a right down that street, follow it around to it's incredible.
Absolutely.
And you still today, if I'm in a rush, it's a black cab in London every single time because they know what's going on.
So London's quite unique. Most cities, like Manchester, we have the taxi driver, but you either tell him where to go or he puts the postcode into his sat-nav.
Yeah.
But taxi drivers in London have to do the knowledge, and so the claim was that by scanning their brains, they found that taxi drivers had larger hippocampi than you or I. Now, there are a number of problems. Firstly, with the arrow of causality.
Yeah, right.
So maybe you can only pass the knowledge if you got a big hippocampus. Yeah. They didn't do a developmental, didn't do a before and after. Right, here's you don't know any street in London, now you know them all, have your hippocampus got bigger. So that's one problem. Second problem is, the hippocampus isn't very big. I mean, our brains aren't really very big. They're kind of this part, and the hippocampus is, I don't know, about that big. So is
that size of what, like a walnut?
Yeah, a bit smaller and kind of elongated shape. Supposedly looks like a seahorse, which is a bit strange. But anyway, they thought it looked like a seahorse, hence its name. But the scanning methods that even now, the scanning methods are very, very noisy.
Yeah.
So it's very difficult to be able to say, okay, you've actually increased. They may well have increased significantly in volume in the test, but whether that is a real, you're relying on this very fuzzy measure. Yeah. So I think most people are rather dubious about this.
But we know that in rodents, at least, there's this kind of almost like literal mapping of an environment in the hippocampus. It's not just like, you're walking around the environment and then you sort of write it down in a bit of code that's in the hippocampus. It's like, I was trying to understand how this worked because it took me a minute to figure out what was really going on here. But as far as I understand, if you sort of, you measure like a particular neuron,
Mhm.
right, in the hippocampus, and you just sort of stay locked on that neuron, and then you watch this rat run around, then if it passes by a particular area, the neuron will fire, and then it will keep running around, and if it goes back to that area, it will fire again.
Yeah,
Back to that area, it will fire again. And it won't be the exact same position, but a sort of rough area, as if to suggest that what's happening is literally just when you're in a particular area, a particular neuron just fires.
Yeah.
And if you stay there, it's firing.
Yeah.
And if you go somewhere else, that stops firing and another one stops firing.
So you've got a map. You've got a map
inside
of the
your
world.
brain, you can sort of, if you imagine all of these neurons laid out inside of the hippocampus, like they're like literally laid out physically in a way that corresponds with the physical environment, which I find quite incredible.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you can then also fool these rats because they can associate, the left-hand side of a room with this neuron firing. And if you just artificially stimulate that neuron, they think they're on the left-hand side of the room, which is kind of cruel. And again, it's so unfortunate that so much of this involves, questionable treatment of animals, to say the least. But it does tell us something really interesting. But I didn't know that we didn't have evidence of place cells.
Well, they haven't found them. I mean, I guess the problem is how are you going to find them?
Yeah,
right?
quite.
So I'm not letting anybody go poking around in my hippocampus and then moving me around the room. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
So they're ethical. My guess is that we will have something similar, but that it's going to be much less developed because our ecology is very different. Okay, so if you're a mouse, you want to go around the edge of a room. You don't want to go around the middle.
Sure.
Right? Humans are going to be much more. You're going to wander all over even a big space.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, if you knew there were big predators around, I don't know, you'd be changing your behavior a bit, but you don't have that instinctive response of keeping to corners or whatever. So the ecology is going to be what is driving brain structure because, and this was Darwin, one of the, saying the problem about function and structure and how does it all work. Darwin worried about this. And then he said, I don't care. I don't care how behavior and consciousness and all that stuff emerges from brains. All I need to know is that there's a link.
Yep.
Because natural selection can affect structures. It can make giraffes' necks grow longer or whatever. And it can affect brains because brains are just structures. And if you affect a brain, its structure, you change behavior. And in fact, it's the other way. You can produce a particular behavior. So, you will be selected for if it's successful, and that part of the brain may grow bigger in the next generation because, overall the population has got more and more people with that particular size of the brain, kind of selected for. So my suspicion would be that humans, for our particular ecology, we may not have as easily detectable a system of place cells as is the case in rodents.
Some people,
but it'd be very odd, I think, if we had no way of, identifying it.
That's cool. It works in 3D space as well. Like if you measure a
bats
bat,
do this absolutely.
Yeah, if you map it onto the world, it creates sort of a sphere in the air of where those neurons would fire, which is incredible. But some people listening, I suppose, in closing here, like, it's very clear that we know very little still, and there's still so many questions to be answered. But some people might be thinking, we've got technologies. Like you said, I'm not going to allow someone to go poking around in my brain. Well, why would you have to? We've got these things like MRI scanners. I've heard of those. You sort of put a big sort of magnet around your head, and can't you just sort of like measure the brain activity and then, go in an MRI and then maybe like stimulate the experience of moving around and just look for place cells, right? Like, it is true that these technologies have been quite revolutionary and changed a lot for us, but perhaps they don't do as much as people think that they can.
I think that's the case, and I'll give you two reasons. Firstly, there's a very big division between, particular fMRI, between researchers who use fMRI, who love it, and those who don't, who are extremely suspicious of it. And the people who use it are, all good people. So I'm not dissing anybody here, but the system is very coarse. In particular, if you're taking the kind of approach that I'm interested in and have been arguing for, a much more cellular approach, then the tiniest voxel, i.e. three-dimensional pixel in one of these scans contains millions and millions of neurons and even more synapses. I mean, so you can't, all that these scans do is say something is happening here.
Right.
Because they measure oxygen levels. So if the cell is active, or the millions of cells in that voxel are active, it lights up.
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't actually light up, but that's what the scan
is represented on the screen.
Because there's more oxygen in there, because there's more blood flowing. That's all it is. It's metabolically active.
So an fMRI scanner just measures blood flow in certain regions of the brain, essentially.
Or the metabolic activity.
Yeah.
And so if it's active, it doesn't tell you whether those cells are on or off. And cells can be activated, they can be inhibited.
Mm-hmm.
So most sensory cells have what's called spontaneous activity. So they just kind of fire at random. If you activate them, they will often start firing very rapidly because they're excited. Some cells, if you activate them, will then turn off completely. So it's not binary, right? You've got negative response.
Yeah.
You got 0. If you want to put it this way, you got 1, 0. 0 is just firing randomly, and then -1, which is nothing there. The smell cells that I've studied in the maggot's nose, not in the human nose, they do exactly that. They will go on in all sorts of interesting ways. They will not change, or they will go off for varying durations. And all those are significant in terms of how the brain's responding. So an fMRI scan, I guess we're back to the climate change thing. That's great for telling us the big weather. Okay, there's a storm coming, and that's pretty accurate, right? So we know when the hurricane's going to hit. On the other hand, it told me that it wasn't going to rain in London, so I didn't bring a coat today. I walked out of the station and there was water, it had been raining. Now, so the localized weather forecast was hopeless, but the big picture is okay.
Yeah.
So it's telling you different things. I guess that's
it's like, it's like sort of if you're staring at the Empire State Building and you're sort of seeing which lights are turned on, you can do that, and that might be useful to some degree, but it's not going to help you work out like the chemical composition of the perfume sat on a shelf in one of the rooms. That requires a little bit more precision, I suppose.
Well, you need to go in and have a look.
Yeah.
So this is the problem with the human brain. It's very difficult to do. So fMRI scans are problematic in that respect. And the other way, I think, is, and this is the most mind-bogglingly thing. So we talked a bit, not that much about consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
So defining it is hellishly difficult. There is no measure of it.
Mm-hmm.
So you cannot put somebody in a scanner. Let's say they're not responsive, one of these locked-in syndromes, where you don't know what's happening. You can't put them in a scanner and say, okay, they're conscious, we should look after them, or they are not conscious, but if they're brain dead, then we know. But you can't tell consciousness from all we know about consciousness is it dissolves in halothane, which is what you have when you're getting a general anesthetic.
Yeah.
So it knocks it out. How that works, we don't know. So if anybody's going under the knife in the next few days, don't worry, because they know exactly what to do. It's just that we don't understand the neural mechanisms. We're getting there to understand the neural mechanisms of general anesthetics.
It's a little scary, because
right. It's not nothing, but be confident you're an anaesthetist.
What if it doesn't get rid of consciousness? What if it just switches off memory?
Don't. No, this is too horrible. Okay, so this is one of the awful hypotheses: is that yes, it doesn't work, it just paralyzes you, and that you don't remember anything.
Yeah. I'm sure it's not.
So you've been in agony for all that time and you don't recall it. I find that very unlikely.
And also, even if that were the case, there are good philosophical reasons to think that wouldn't matter when all is said and done.
Well, it would matter to you at the time, but if you didn't remember, you'd be like HM, right? You had done the experiment the day before, you had no idea. But I hope that's not true.
Quite extra. Yeah, but
I don't think that was a very fair thing. There may be people out there who are going to.
No, I know. That is very unfair. Well, all I know is that everyone I've ever known who's undergone such a thing has actually found it kind of enjoyable. It's like a little experiment.
Yeah, absolutely. They count.
Yeah,
and then you're out, and then you wake up and you're back.
Yeah, but I remember I spoke to someone on this show the other day, Bernardo Kastrup, who said, when he was being anesthetized, he wanted to kind of do an experiment. He was like, I'm going to try as hard as I can stay awake, and so he starts counting. He's like, 1, 2, 3. He's like 4. He goes 5, and then he says to the doctor, like, is it normal for it to take this long? And they go like, oh, we're nearly done. And he's like, what? It's amazing that I'd love to experience.
Well, the anaesthetists, I think, get used to people thinking I can beat the system.
But he didn't even, for him, it was just like a continual sort of line of experience. It was kind of terror. And as a philosopher, he was like, the way that those two, that sort of big gap, you can just take each end and stitch them together into a continual experience.
Well, that's partly what perception is, right? So we're not perceiving reality.
Yeah.
It's not unmediated. It feels like we got these holes in our eyes and everything's just coming and all our senses just getting this information. We know that's not the case.
Yeah.
There's a delay.
Yeah.
There's a delay in perception, which is simply the delay in the activity of the neurons. They take a few hundred milliseconds. So something happens, you hit your foot, and then you will detect it. Those cells are going to take about 150, 200 milliseconds to respond. By the time it gets up here, it's a bit longer. So Helmholtz was the first neuropsychologist to work this out in the 19th century. He said, well, wait a minute. What about whales? If I tweak the tail of a whale, when does it finally work out that something's happened? His calculations suggest it was about a second and a half.
Really?
So we're living in the past.
Yeah.
And above all, those pasts aren't going to be identical for different sensory systems, but we're making sense of stuff. Just like in perception, again, Helmholtz showed this. There are these, people probably know about the blind spot. If you stare at it, fixate at a particular point, then there's part of your visual field around here and here, which there's nothing there. And yet you don't feel that there's a big black hole. Your brain is just kind of, it's like Photoshop, just blurring it in. Okay, right, we'll stamp that. Okay, copy that, copy and paste. Can sense something out there.
There are experiments you can do, like the famously, big sort of white screen, and they put a spot at the right area, and if you move it to the right distance, it just disappears.
Yeah, you can't see things.
But even then, it's not like you suddenly, now I can see the big black hole. It just fills it in white. Your brain just sort of lies to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, what Helmholtz said, which is incredibly smart for a guy in the 19th century, is that the brain is making hypotheses about the inductive hypotheses. It's looking at the world, it works out what probably should be there, and then it tells you that story. Most of the time, that's fine. You put yourself in a weird psychology experiment, and then you can detect it. But because you're moving your eyes around all the time, we don't notice the
that's not the kind
spot.
of thing that you can test for. Like you say, you can test for the neuronal activity, although I'm still not quite sure how that, like an MRI scanner, it's magnetic, right? And I don't actually know how it measures the oxygen blood. I imagine that's extremely complicated.
Yeah.
Some kind of
I don't know. I'm not enough of a physicist to be able to explain.
However they do it, firstly, it measures only at a sort of zoomed out resolution. Secondly, it's measuring brain activity, and consciousness is correlated with that, maybe caused by it, but there's no guarantee of that. And it's like the one thing in science that seems to resist measurement. But my final question for you then is, I'm going to do the thing that the publisher asks you to do, but hopefully with a little bit more precision and a recognition that this is purely speculation. Do you think it ever will be able to? Do you think you'll ever be able to look at a brain and see consciousness?
Yes. But I say yes, but I've recognised that is almost an article of faith.
Yeah.
But it's faith not in an old book or in some old belief, but it's a faith that we got this far already.
Yes.
That is the scientific method and scientific approaches will get there in the end, I'm confident. But just remember, physicists don't know what 90% of the universe is made of. Right. So we will understand that in the end, I hope. But these are massive problems that have bedeviled us for millennia. And I think all we can do, I don't think people should despair, right? And despair can take the form of going, hey man, everything's conscious. Panpsychism is one very fashionable thing, especially, if you are interested in psychedelic drugs, which, seem to change your perception. Well, they do change your perception and understanding of reality. Then you can think, okay, well, maybe this chair's conscious.
Yeah.
But that actually is, you're not explaining anything. No. I'm not into that.
That's the biggest criticism of the panpsychist worldview, is that it's a sort of panpsychism of the gaps.
Yeah,
it's the same thing that people did with God.
Yeah.
I've had a few panpsychists on this show, and I've been talking about that view and idealism a bunch. And I get a lot of flack, actually, for I get excited about an idea, and then I bring on a few people who talk about it, and I get sort of accused of sort of going too hard on that worldview. So it's nice to have some sort of materialists on the show as well. I've made a conscious effort, if you will, to try to bring a variance of people on. But I'll leave the panpsychists to speak for themselves. Since
they could be right. So my view, I'm very, very confident we will, not in my lifetime, I'm sure of that, right? Because that'll be 20, 30 years. That's no way we're going to make a breakthrough in that kind of time scale. Unless something very, very strange happens. So it's possible, maybe large language models could be able to pull something out of this huge tsunami of data I mentioned.
Sure.
And maybe it'll all come clear. I mean, certainly that's the kind of thing people are trying to do, to see, can these machines see patterns that we can't? I still guess we haven't got the right kind of data to be able to do that. But that may well be an approach that will happen this century. I mean, listeners and viewers, if they're still around, in another 60 odd years, may go, ha, you see, we got there.
Yeah, things often come faster than you expect.
But it may be that it takes millennia.
Yeah,
I don't know. What can we do?
I did a panel recently with Brian Cox.
Oh, yeah.
And it's the first time I'd met him, and there were some questions that were going to be from the audience, and some of them were sort of about panpsychism and that stuff, and he, to say the least, wasn't really sort of feeling it. And I sort of tried to say, look, like, maybe it deserves a hearing, and I just remember saying to him, like, look, it is growing in popularity, this view. And he said, so is Nigel Farage, is what he said in response. Okay, touche, fair enough. But I like, I understand why. I think it's silly to ask scientists, or indeed historians, things like what will happen in the future, because who knows. But I love asking, just on like a speculative, friendly level, what do you think? And I like what you said. It's sort of, it's not faith in the books of the past, it's faith in the books of the future.
Yeah, I think that's a nice way of putting it. The last paragraph is my attempt to sum up what might happen, and it basically, I mean, no reviewers or nobody I've talked to has ever commented on this. Perhaps I haven't spoken to the most learned people, but I stole it off Nietzsche. So I was reading a biography of Nietzsche. Nietzsche, in one of his more crazed moments, is talking about the future and the philosophy of the future. And he just, because he was going a bit bonkers when he wrote it, he just kind of spews out all these possible alternatives, which is kind of what I did. And partly to keep everybody on board, I listed all the various approaches there are trying to understand how brains work and what consciousness might be, and they're all listed. And then at the end, and this is what I stole from Nietzsche, it's this, or this, or this, or this. And then the last word is or ... So in other words, he left it open. And I just thought, how astonishingly bold to finish on saying, make it up. You work it out.
Yeah.
You're going to find out what's happening. That was partly, as I said, the book is not just a history, it's also trying to point the way forward. And part of it was not a challenge, but a way of talking to my neuroscience colleagues and saying, well, okay, if none of this fits, if all of these various options that people have got at the moment aren't right, then what can you come up with?
Yeah.
And we'll see.
We'll see. The book is The Idea of the Brain. It's, of course, linked in the description. Matthew Cobb.
Excellent.
Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much. It's been great.
If you enjoyed that, you might like my previous episode with Peter Godfrey Smith on the consciousness of animals. You can watch it by clicking the link that's on your screen. To support my work and get early ad-free access to episodes, subscribe to my Substack at alexoconnor.com. Thanks for watching.